Come down, come down.
We are live streaming in less than a minute. So we are already live streaming now on our YouTube channel. Iman, can you just turn your phone mute? We can hear some background noise. So with this, we can begin. Bhavna, over to you.
Yeah. Am I audible, Manish? Is it clear?
Yes, please go ahead.
Namaskar, and a very good evening to all participants joining us from various parts of India and the globe for our first Indraprastha Grand Strategy Conference being held today and tomorrow. I am Bhavna Bhare, President of the Indian Futures. I take this opportunity to welcome you all today on behalf of the Indian Futures. I cannot but begin by hoping you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. I take this opportunity to offer our deepest tributes and condolences to all the families who lost their loved ones in the tragic accident, including our CDS General Rawatji. May God give eternal peace to their departed souls. It's indeed a great loss for all Indians. Let me also, as always, introduce TIF very briefly. We are a New Delhi-based independent think tank that started out our journey in January 2016 with the sole aim to creating a global but India-centric platform to plainly and dispassionately discuss in the truest ancient Bharatiya tradition of a samvad, the ideas of a new India. We at the TIF seek to go beyond the headlines for the day and have a deep, honest conversation amongst the thinking community in India and abroad. We are extremely proud to have recently hosted some of India's finest minds from the world of government, politics, academia, diplomacy, and culture. Let me also set the ball rolling by introducing today's conference grand strategy. To put it very simply, mean as alignment of unlimited aspirations and limited capacities of a state. It involves combining a state's political, diplomatic, economic, and military resources for securing one state. Looking at Indian debates in strategic and foreign policy arenas, many analysts, India and non-Indian, remain seriously dismissive about any Indian grand strategy. But lately, some analysts have begun mapping and trying to articulate various strands in Indian grand strategy. This conference surely adding to that enterprise in the best possible way for assembling the best strategic minds from history, geography, military, strategy, economics, and foreign policy. We surely intend to bring all deliberations therein in the form of an edited volume very soon. With this, now I request Dr. Meena Singh Roy, TIF Distinguished Fellow in our West Asia program, to kickstart the first session titled Lessons of History. Over to you, Dr. Roy.
Thank you, Bhavna, and pleasure sharing this panel with such distinguished speakers that you've lined up for the first session. And I also compliment, Manish and the team for starting this first dialogue, which has been much in demand, I would say. And I have been given very strict instructions by Manish that we have to finish this dialogue by 6:30, this particular session of the dialogue. So I'm going to probably, tell each speaker to stick to the timings, which is 10 minutes to 12 minutes. And let's hope, that we don't have to interrupt you in between. You will automatically probably close your remarks within 10 to 12 minutes. And I just don't want to, sort of waste time in giving a long introduction to the speakers who are very, well-known speakers, and, they have such a prolific profile, and without getting much into the detailing, I would request Gautam Chikarmane, who is the Vice President of ORF. But before I give you hand over the opportunity to sort of speak, I just want to make a few comments. And here I would say that, this is a very timely, as I said, conference that is being organized. We are in the time of a great geopolitical transformation today. And we are witnessing a dramatic shift in global power dynamics, even in the region, if you look at it. And I think it's the time for each nation. They are repositioning, themselves in terms of alliances and, re-articulating their foreign policies. And it is also the time when India is very well positioned in terms of, its status, its image, and even the expectations from the regional and the global, partners. They expect much more. And I believe this is also the right time that we start, thinking about, how do we frame the grand strategies, which would, of course, help us in terms of increasing our economic profile, in terms of, creating a situation where, we have all the resources, but we need to ensure that, every aspect of our capacity and capability is reflected in our foreign policy and internal policy implementations in that sense. And there is so much to draw from the history. And let's first hear the speakers, and I'll probably have a few minutes to give my own comments, maybe at the later if time permits it. So over to you, Mr. Gautam. The floor is yours.
There is something which is telling me to unmute. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So Meena ji, Bhavna ji, Manish ji, thank you very much for inviting me for this first Indraprastha Grand Strategy Conference. It's a privilege to be here among fellow scholars to engage with such a crucial topic, grand strategy. I see several colleagues who are walking on this path. I also see several gurus, Vikram Sood. He's sitting there, and it's an honor for me that he is here to listen to this. To me, the Mahabharata is several doors, paths, journeys across time, space, and evolution. One of those doors opens into the grand strategy universe. In this universe lie galaxies of tactics. Within these galaxies stand individual characters who engage with war and peace, victories and defeats, philosophy and ethics, politics and governance, all of them functioning within the boundaries of a dharmic grand strategy. When they step out of this universe or breach it, they are condemned. When they work within this universe, they are celebrated. And then there are several permutations and combinations that this grand strategy captures, typical of the open source nature of the base philosophy, Sanatan Dharma. Despite the flexibility it allows, the grand strategy conversations in the Mahabharata are complex, and their amoeba-like characteristics can disarm the strongest of characters. This universe of grand strategy expands and contracts, twists and turns. It is not a one book, one idea, one structure, one grand strategy universe. It is not fundamentalist in its approach. It is not dogmatic. It is a dynamic entity. It changes across time and space and events and individuals and collectivities, and above all, nations. And yet, somewhere, it is constant. Something like a dharmic gravity that holds the world with all its constituents, humans, animals, plants, ecosystem, together. The constant and the eternal anchor of time and space, societies and individuals, kingdoms and civilizations. That's the Mahabharata for you. In this short introductory talk, I will talk about grand strategy in the Mahabharata. It is based on 3 key citations. First, the critical edition of the Mahabharata put together by the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute in 1966 and translated into English by Vivek Debroy in 2015. Second, its analysis by Shri Aurobindo in 1902. You will be hearing a lot about him this year. It is his 150th birth anniversary on 15th August 2022, and I'm working on a book on Shri Aurobindo, which you will hear about later next year. And third, its analysis by V.S. Sukthankar in 1957, a scholar of mathematics, Sanskrit, and Indology, and the first general editor of the critical edition. All errors are mine, all credit theirs. As all of us know, the overarching strategic idea in the Mahabharata is dharma. For scholars of philosophy, culture, and history, the complexity of this word, dharma, won't be lost. Its formidable vastness and impossibility of the human mind to hold it won't be missed. For others, its reduction into what is loosely known as religion is an equally large universe. Both the thinker with her ideas and the doer going about her work play with incomplete dialogues. They need to improvise moment to moment, conflict to conflict. In this aspect, the Mahabharata is merciless, brutal, and within this dichotomy of ideas and actions, dharma remains the stable underlying grand strategy. As a student of the Mahabharata, when I enter this textual universe, I see not one, but 3 grand strategies as at play, each as important as the other, and all 3 working together in harmony integrally. Sometimes this harmony is visible, the contradiction-free ideas and actions of Sri Krishna, for instance. But mostly it is invisible, the manner in which Drona or Duryodhana are killed. In the invisible too lies a completion where the apparent breach, the surface level breach of dharma, is part of a narrative of revenge or redemption, both functioning under a higher law. Of the 3, the first grand strategy is philosophical, spiritual, or the overarching idea called dharma. From righteousness to varna dharma, to dharma of war, dharma of governance, even dharma of conquest. I will not explore this here. I don't have the time. You will find all possible permutations and combinations across the text, especially in the Vana Parva and the Shanti Parva. The third grand strategy revolves around individuals who act according to what they think their dharma of the moment is. Yudhishthir versus Dhritarashtra, Bhim versus Duryodhana, Arjun versus Karna, 6 warriors versus Abhimanyu. And if you want to add an outer strategic dimension, the use of Shakti by Karna to kill Ghatotkach. From the killing of Bhurishravas by Satyaki to the killings of the Pandava children at night by Ashwatthama, all the war parvas explore this theme in great detail. It is the most exciting part, but I will let this pass. It is the Mahabharata's second aspect of grand strategy that I will talk about here. That's because within the narrow confines of how modern scholars define it, it is the political, the security, the military, and the strategic dimensions that are part of grand strategy. Ideas like dharma, ethics, righteousness have been evicted from this discourse and replaced by a pettiness of thought and ruthlessness of action. For instance, the crude mantra that all scholars swear by today, there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. This statement has been glamorized beyond repair. So far gone is this line that, for instance, the European Union is giving up the very basis of its union, the values, when it comes to dealing with China. In the pursuit of its grand strategy of dominating the world, China is using all tactics and in a perverse manner uniting the world, the US, Australia, Czech Republic, and recently Lithuania. The grand strategy in the Mahabharata too pursued interests, but the centrifugal forces behind such interests were all bound together by dharma. In other words, despite a huge diversity of peoples, geographies, foods, cultures, religions, Aryavarta was united by an idea called dharma. Within the physical differences, there was a spiritual, cultural unity. Against this backdrop, let's take the political military alignments in the run-up to the Kurukshetra. If we step back, we see the Kuru Empire as the center of Aryavarta civilization, the strongest kingdom of the time, harboring the centripetal ambition of empire building. In that context, the fratricidal fight between the Pandavas and the Kauravas becomes incidental, at best a tipping point, not the causality of 100 kingdoms coming together to fight a great war. Battleground Kurukshetra was more than a struggle for kingship. It was a grand strategy aligned with dharma on one side and adharma on the other. Again, this is not a straight binary. Within this duality, there are several layers and levels. What's even more important is how the smaller kingdoms saw their interests and acted within these two grand strategies. The final coalitions tell us interesting stories and build complex narratives. These narratives can be bound together around those who wanted a strong center, the centripetal force. This is taken from Shri Aurobindo's work. And those who fiercely cherished their independence, the centrifugal force. Something like what's going on right now as the US-USSR bipolar world of yesterday faces pressures towards either an expansion towards a more equal multipolar world on one side and a descent into a new US-China bipolar world on the other. These are alignments that modern India in particular and rest of the world in general are grappling with today. By decimating 7 generations of Kshatriyas, the Brahmin warrior Parshuram had destroyed all the centripetal forces of the past. In the civilizational vacuum that followed, centrifugal forces grew, but they were unstable and replaced again by the centripetal force, first administered by the Koshalas, and then again, after a period of centrifugal breakdown into their constituent parts, by the Kurus under King Dhritarashtra. This is despite the presence of strong kingdoms led by strong leaders, the Panchalas under Drupad, the Chedis under Shishupal, the Yadavas at Dwarka. The sole competitor to the Kurus who tilted the centripetal power scales for a short duration until he was killed by Bhim was Jarasandh of Magad. His death is a big chapter in the actioning of the Pandava grand strategy. Coming to the final part of this talk, which is the political military alignments, we find some contradictory trends where the personal has been discarded in favor of the public. The myopia of family or past battles has given way to the embrace of a larger centrifugal grand strategy. Shalya of Madra supported the Kauravas despite being the brother of Madri, the wife of King Pandu, and the mother of Nakul and Sahadev, his nephews. You would think that blood was thicker than the alleged comforts Shalya received on the way to war, but that was not the case. The kings of Magad and Chedi supported the Pandavas despite a violent past, where Jarasandh and Shishupal were killed by Bhim and Sri Krishna. You would think that they should have aligned against the Pandavas, if not for the Kauravas, simply to get a chance at extracting revenge. But again, that is not the case. When we step back, we see that the large kingdoms of the West supported the Kauravas, Madra, Gandharva, as did the large kingdoms of the South, Avanti, Kalinga. Kingdoms of the East, which had a memory of the centripetal glory through the Ikshvaku empire of the past, supported the Pandavas. These included Kashi and Mathura. So did the Panchals under Drupad and Matsya under Virat. Here, the familial ties joined hands with grand strategy ambitions. Strong kingdoms outside the civilizational center remained fragmented. The prime example is Yadavas. Their army fought for the Kauravas, their leader Sri Krishna for the Pandavas. In fact, Arjun choosing Sri Krishna over his powerful army is possibly the grandest of all grand strategies when looked at integrally, that is, keeping the overarching dharma in mind. It tells us that nations need to follow their dharma irrespective of what others do or how successful they are. On the other hand, Duryodhan's grandest grand strategy was to defeat Yudhishthir in the game of dice and exile the Pandavas for 13 years. Expanding the centrifugal argument, the grand strategy alignments of this great war can be divided into 3 parts. First, those who sought centrifugal autonomy. Second, those who were aspirants to a centripetal power centricity. Both these put their lot with the Kauravas, perhaps in the knowledge that Duryodhan's would be a short-timed empire and could either be broken out of or challenged. The third, who wanted a centripetal power structure that recreated a united Aryavata civilization headed by the Pandavas, guided by Shri Krishna, and functioning under Dharma. As I conclude, I can't help but note that the Kurukshetra of 5,000 years ago is playing out in 21st century India. The grand strategy of the 21st century is far more complex, far more global, far more layered. But the motivations of nations have remained the same: power, security, alliance on the one side, and the balancing of centripetal and centrifugal forces on the other. At this moment, there are two competing ideologies, the democratic and the authoritarian. The fundamental designs of these two opposing ideas are the US and China. For now, China has made its aggressive hegemonic intentions clear, so the US becomes the default strategic alignment for India and other democracies. But remember, US is not a dependable ally. India's grand strategy will also be shaped by the grand strategies of the EU, Russia, and African nations on the expansionary side, and Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Turkey on the defensive. Due to physical distance, South American nations will remain on the fringe. India's grand strategy will be shaped by a strengthening economy. It will be shaped by technological independence. It will change with the end of poverty. It will be influenced by a rising national consumer power. And above all, it will be molded by a stronger military-industrial complex. It will mean creating values, reaching out to those who reflect and echo with these values, and standing up to the biggest grand strategy threat this world has faced since World War II, Chinese hegemony. All these streams are playing out in one way or another. The last leg of creating and debating India's grand strategy will have to be framed within and anchored to the question, who are we? That is, understanding that India is an old civilization but a young nation. The strategic wisdom of the past must inform India as it negotiates the complex world of tomorrow. There are deep grand strategy insights that India in the 21st century can glean and adapt from its ancient past to power its future. I have spoken about the Mahabharata, and despite its universality, there are other texts from which India can glean this knowledge. A final word: read the Mahabharata slowly, carefully, and concentratedly. Read it in its unabridged form, preferably in Sanskrit. There is enough information, knowledge, and wisdom lying there, waiting to express itself in modern India. And as India's Rajasic energies are unleashed, as its power grows, and as its compassion pervades trade and strategic negotiations, COVID-19 philanthropy, for instance, India's grand strategy will take shape. As scholars in this space, we need to take lessons from actors of the past to influence actors of the present and lay the grand strategy foundations for actors of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was an extremely, I would say, comprehensive presentation, because you encapsulated all the learnings of Mahabharata within 10 minutes. And I think that's the credit. There is so much to learn from our, past literature and ethics that we have, but how do we use it to maximize our own potential is the major challenge, I guess. And I hope, such studies, and when we publish it, it is marketed well. And I only wish that the policymakers will actually benefit a lot if the way you have done that comparison, as to what happened in Mahabharata and how we can use it in the present day context. And that's what is the essence of what we can draw and the lessons that we can take from what are the mistakes that happened in Mahabharata. Probably, one can even look at those, and that probably should be utilized by us who have so much to learn from our old civilization and the literature, the rich literature that we still have. Thank you so much, Mr. Gautam Chikarmane, and we would love to have your written chapter when this comes out in the form of a book. Thank you once again. And I think our second speaker, Santishree Pandit, she's having some technical issues there. So I would request Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh, who's also a good friend and a brilliant scholar. Not taking much time, I hand over, the platform to you, and please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Roy. Thank you, Manish, Bhavna, TIF for this really terrific initiative. I think it was absolutely wisely stated that at the time of transformations and transitions that we are facing today, particularly over the last decade, where you're seeing sort of a breakdown or inflection points across dimensions of the international order, there was never perhaps a time to acquire or at least spread this idea that we need to be a bit more coherent across the instruments of national security, foreign policy, even the economy, to sort of have a slightly longer view. So I found this really interesting quote listening to John Lewis Gaddis, who's probably one of the most authoritative historians in the United States, particularly on the Cold War era. He spoke of a civilized culture, an intelligent elite, if they could possess the ability to operate with two opposing ideas at the same time. I think for Indians, this comes quite naturally. I think the Cold War period showed, and today itself, that when you are faced with sort of irreconcilable ideologies or belief systems internationally, you can still find your way and navigate that space. So at least on that ingredient, India does possess the aspects of a grand strategy. Just a bit sort of as a prelude, one of the reasons why I got into looking at Indian strategic history was, as many of you are aware, there has been this debate or this context where we are being told rather patronizingly by certain Western scholars over the last 3-4 decades that during the Cold War period, okay, what's done is done. Now you entered this post-Cold War phase, and it's not really clear if you have a strategic culture, and this is something that needs to be developed. And so I think to counter that narrative, it's been done over the last 20-30 years by a series of thinkers, scholars in India and abroad. And I would like to sort of place my works in that genre, where we try to sort of put across the idea that contrary to this claim, there was phases of coherent strategic behavior by the Indian state over the last 7 decades. That is not to suggest that the efficacy and the efficiency and the outcomes were always as intended, but that's perhaps a second order question, which we also should get into. Maybe firstly on the definition, Rush Doshi, a very interesting scholar who's currently in the National Security Council in the Biden administration, he's done some very interesting work on China's grand strategy, and he defines it as a state's theory of how it can achieve security-related ends for itself that is intentional, coordinated, and implemented across multiple means of statecraft, such as military, economic, and political instruments. Now, of course, this is really an idealistic situation. We all know that most political economies and states today aren't as autonomous, unless you're talking of an extreme authoritarian state where they have complete command and control. You're usually dealing with a variety of interests and a variety of political and national security instruments, and to mobilize them and channel them in those directions, you might not attain this level of definition, but certainly the idea that grand strategy is a coherent way to approach the ends and means to advance and secure a way of life and order, I think that is a definition which we can go to. So this still leaves open the question of what are we securing and what does order look like from a particular state's perspective. So for example, we often hear US grand strategy is built on the idea of promoting openness and liberty. China's is on rejuvenation, that is present day China. Russia's is on the idea of a balance of power and global strategic stability. Now, each of these powers have distinct national prisms and manifest destinies, often shaped by their unique historical experiences. So one of the aims for us in India has been that what are those ingredients that underpin India's grand strategic approach since the 1940s. So I found since the transfer of power, independence, the post-colonial phase that starts in 1947, 1950, you have sort of 4 or 5 phases of a way of approaching international order and India's foreign policy. So we're familiar with many of these, but I'll just sort of briefly elucidate. You have the Nehruvian phase, which really comes into being in about 1950 with the breakout of the Korean War. That's the first sort of trigger for the Cold War when it enters Asia. If you recall, before 1950, most of the US-Soviet struggle was in the European front. This comes into Asia, and that's when India's foreign policy, based on a particular understanding of the ruling dispensation at the time, and a very small group led by the Prime Minister and his confidants, they come up with a grand strategy. I mean, I'm talking loosely, but an approach to security that was built on stabilizing the Cold War, which is the competition between the two systems. And it was believed at the time quite strongly by this group that if you were to stabilize competition between the two powers, and US and China at the time were undergoing extensive competition or on the verge to, it was seen that if you could stabilize that, you could also make the international environment around India conducive to focus on whatever, domestic stability, stabilizing the post-partition economy, et cetera, et cetera. This phase breaks down with the China crisis, of course, in the late 1950s. We see a more conventional realpolitik that comes in, which we recognize more easily today, which was the approach that you are going to focus more on your region, more on national security, more on territorial security. The idea of world order was still present. I think Indian policymakers throughout these phases have always believed a plural world order is something that is conducive to India, and it's also resonates with the Indian, whether traditional culture or even just the way it sees the world should be configured. I think hegemonic systems are something that repel or repulse India in a sense, because we are the victims of the European domination in Asia, which came from their hegemony. So I think it's almost in our DNA to promote multipolarity. That's there. This phase of the post-Nehruvian phase of the 1960s was really, in fact, compared to today, it was even more dramatic in terms of the challenges that it brought. We had not only a two-front challenge with the China northern border, Pakistan on two fronts. You also had a Pakistan allied with a US NATO system. So it was like a multi-front challenge. And we arrived at grand strategy, a balance of power strategy, by developing a deep strategic partnership with Soviet Russia at the time, which also had similar concerns on this kind of realignments that were coming in. It becomes stronger in the 1970s with the US-China normalization, which totally sort of changed the balance of power or put it back in the United States' favor. You then have the post-Cold War 1990s, where India's foreign policy again starts to resemble a lot like what China was after 1979, where the economy, modernization, domestic stability again starts to become the first order priority rather than world order in a more generic sense. So these sort of 5 phases, and we're at the 5th phase, where the post-2008 period, which is it's generally believed that the global economic crisis of 2008 has broken or ended the post-Cold War sort of unipolar system. And since 2008, we've seen a series of regional pushbacks, whether from Iran, from Russia, from China, India sort of less so, but certainly there's been an attempt since the early 2000, 2014, 15, 16 to also try and stabilize and strengthen its position on its periphery. So this revolt, so to speak, by the regional powers who were unwilling to submit themselves to a US dominated system is a sort of a signal that we are approaching multipolarity if we already haven't sort of arrived at that state. I would say the next question sort of would be that what are the sort of the overriding aspects that we can see through these phases that are common to in the last 6-7 decades? So I could see 4 or 5 again, which I will sort of state, and I think you can see it across political formations, across time and space, right up to the present day. So the number one factor would be, which has been part of India's grand strategic thinking, is preserving identity and strategic independence. That's been there. It was called non-alignment then, we call it strategic autonomy now, or even if you don't call it anything, I think it's inbuilt into the Indian strategic consciousness and political consensus that you can't break away from that independence, strategic independence. So it has definitely certain implications on how you can develop your strategic partnerships. As we've seen over the last 2 decades, it limits what you can do. But I think if we are talking of India having its own manifest destiny as a major power, a major civilization that's rejuvenating itself, that stakes a claim to be a center of power in the coming decades, then I think most Indians recognize that it can't happen without preserving your strategic independence and a distinct civilizational identity. I think that's a given. The other aspect that's been there throughout is securing your interests in regional security, territorial security, and the subcontinental order. But there are differences in terms of tactics and means how this goal was pursued over the last 7 decades. So, for example, the Nehruvian period gave less emphasis to realpolitik policies, or let's say a more assertive approach to the neighborhood. It was built on some sort of an accommodation, built on great power stability, which could be brought into the neighborhood. That breaks down, and then you see a far more assertive approach that comes in the 60s and 70s. Of course, 71 is the culmination of India claiming some sort of regional leadership in South Asia. And it does last for a long period until you see a pushback by the United States and China, which rearms West Pakistan, provides it nuclear capability. So we can't actually technically claim to have hegemony in South Asia. It's contested by the major powers from that period and continue to this day. The other aspect that's been there throughout is advancing geoeconomic interests in international scientific networks, developmental finance, growth options. So even when trade was limited, there was a whole lot of industrial transfers coming back and forth, both from the Western and Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. And it continues to. We continue to have these networks. And a lot of India's grand strategy, in some sense, could be said, how do you enhance these and at the same time, even if many of those states don't get along with each other. And I think the fact that we are able to do so perhaps tells us that we are somewhat sort of astute and successful in managing this sort of complexity and drawing those links. Again, it's a second order question of, are we able to then convert that the ability to connect with more advanced technological centers of power and then bring domestic transformations with that? I think it's domestic political economy weaknesses that don't allow us to fully tap the geopolitical access or the geoeconomic access that we do have today. So I suppose that could be one of the questions that we should be asking in terms of our quality of our institutions, our political economy, how we manage state-private capital relations in a vision for a industrial blueprint, etc. So, and of course, like I mentioned, the biggest sort of vision or grand strategic approach that has been throughout from the 1940s has been that India must not allow the global world order or the regional or the extra-regional order to ever fall under the sway of a single power. And today, if there are attempts by any rising power, like China in this case, to extend some sort of a hegemony in South Asia, I think that will be resisted, and it is being resisted. So I think we see some of these common features. And Dr. Roy, I think maybe if we get a chance to bring that conversation forward, we can get there. So I can conclude now. Thanks.
Dr. Roy, please unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Professor Zorawar Daulet Singh. It was a pleasure listening to you, and the way you've explained the various phases of India's grand strategic approach to dealing with various problems, and how what are the common factors during these 5 phases that you talked about. And of course, it would be of course much more interesting to know from all of you, maybe at the end when we come back to the final round, to know as to what should be the major features of India's grand strategy in the new narrative, in the new situation, and what are the elements that we need to focus on. And I think that probably would be a takeaway for all of us. We have the next speaker now. Thank you, Zorawar, and we'll come back to you maybe if time permits us. I would request all of you to comment on the future aspects of our grand strategy. With that, I move on to our next speaker, Professor Santishree, Dr. Pandit. Welcome to the forum, and I would not waste much time introducing all of you, because you're all well-known sort of scholars in your own areas, and we just would want to listen more from you. And so straight away, I would ask you to give your views on the subject. Thank you. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. Dr. Manish Dabade, I thank you for inviting me and the other panelists, respected panelists. I would go straight to the topic, that is on the lessons of history when we decide on strategy. I would rather like to ask certain questions. Do we have a normative deficiency? How are we going to bridge this normative deficiency? What is it I'm trying to say? I'm touching upon 4 major issues on our very issue of writing history. The Western method of writing history has been in the written form, but in India, we have a tradition of oral history, Smriti and Shruti. And it doesn't mean that we do not have a strategic culture that is very recent. I would not accept the point that it is only in the 18th century or in the 20th century once we got independence. I would rather say if we need a normative framework like the Chinese, we will have to go back to the beginnings of our civilization. And I think we are one of the unique civilizations. China and India are the only civilization states to enter the 4th industrial revolution. The continuity and the change has to be brought in. While talking about this, even if we had written sources, because of destruction of universities like Nalanda and Takshashila, our sacred spaces by predatory invaders is also an issue we'll have to highlight. History cannot be whitewashed to please a contemporary reality. Even if we see in the while talking, we have colonial era prejudices. Most of the history writing that has come to us have been written by Christian missionaries. Coming from the south of the country, I come from the state of Tamil Nadu. This whole Aryan-Dravidian divide is an artificial construction done by Robert Cardwell when he wrote the book on the grammar of the Dravidian languages. And here he constructed this so-called difference that the Dravidians are a totally different race, which brought in this divide. So it was done with certain purpose. I would quote Robert Cox. Every theory is done for some purpose and in some context and for someone. So let us be very clear on that. This is like saying that if the hunter writes the history, it needs the hunted also to say their point of view. And I think in the Indian context, somehow we have had towers of silence. The other major issue that I would like to draw is Delhi's monopoly of history writing, both in the 18th century and after post-independence, from my dear university, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Basically, they have given the impression that India is a land power. We're ignoring our extraordinary maritime past. Thus, it is possible to grow up in India without hearing anything about the exploits of ancient Odia manners, the links of the Cholas and the Pallavas in Southeast Asia, or Indo-Roman trade. This is rather like relating European history without mentioning Athens, Venice, Portugal, Spain, and England. So I think there is a huge problem in our writing of history, and even post-independence writing of history has been dominated by a particular narrative that has whitewashed dynasties from where I come. Vijay Nagar, Cholas, they ruled for 2000 years. You don't even mention them in a page. The Cheras. So I think there has to be a re-evaluation if we are to talk about our lessons of history. Now, after I've stated this, the two issues that I've raised is, one I would like to speak about is being a woman. I would say there is a gender perspective. When you talk of grand strategies, it's just not one view. There has to be even a gender view. So you do have, both from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, as well as from the Silapadikaram, which is from the 3rd century BC, the symbol of Kannagi. Kannagi was the symbol of an independent common woman who fought the king. So we have, and the second is, you have even warrior queens in the south who were there, who had their own strategies. And second is, I also want to just place two ideas. One is Draupadi, the image of Draupadi as the woman who literally ran the war, the Mahabharata war. And Sita as the single mother in the history of the world. So I think there is time that we need to go back, hermeneutics, reinterpret these texts that are there with us. Because of the shortage of time, I'm not going to go in. The second area I want to touch upon is the maritime past. Grossly neglected in Indian strategic history. I don't think being only a land power completely makes you a complete power. India has a huge maritime coast. And here I would like to draw two important, lessons that we can learn. One is the exploits of Rajendra Chola in building up the triangle in the Indo-Pacific. And whom did he take on? The Chinese and the Shri Vijaya expedition, the Suvarna Deepa. So if we see very clearly, he brought in the military campaigns, which was a triangle in the Indo-Pacific. And I think it's very, very necessary that this history has to be read more seriously than just a marginalized part of the dominant hegemonic narrative that we have even built post-independence. So I think one is the Cholas and their military campaigns. And there are a lot of sources, even in trade. What was the reason that they had this armada? It was basically to promote trade. So you also have, they did not conquer, they were not predators. The way they spread culture was through trade and culture. They did not invade there. They had them as vassals, made them pay, but kept the ocean sea lanes open. This is a challenge for us today with rising China. And the country that Rajendra Chola was able to contain was the Chinese. So here are huge lessons. And I think we should not forget this. The other I would like to bring in is the Marathas. Many of us have forgotten, or we refuse to even acknowledge any of the dynasties that have come from below the Vindhyas. Most of us know that the Maratha are credited for ending Mughal rule over most of the Indian subcontinent. The Marathas were a Marathi-speaking warrior group from the Western Deccan Plateau, present-day Maharashtra, who rose to prominence by establishing a Hindavi Swaraj. There are different interpretations to it. I would not go into. So Shivaji's army has two lessons for us for a grand strategy. One, the concept of asymmetric warfare, something we are doing gaga, giving the credit to the West. I think we Indians need a sense of history and a sense of pride. That there are, and if you see here, he is seen as one of the originators of guerrilla warfare. He defeated the Mughal army, which was 10 times bigger than his, with very few soldiers, as much as only 3,000 as against 30,000. So here is a lesson from history. Why are we ignoring it? I just don't understand what is happening to most of our Indian interpreters who want to build norms. The other is the maritime strategy of the Marathas. Let us not forget that Sardar Angre is seen as the first general who controlled the entire Arabian coast for the Marathas. And he also forced most of the European countries to pay if they had to come into this coast or use it for any of purposes of seafaring. So you have examples where we would need, for example, this maritime dominance was built during this Maratha period. And many people, most of you may not even know who Sardar Angre is. So this is very unfortunate. So my basic contention before all the learned panel and all scholars and others is that it is very, very necessary for us to reevaluate our history if we have to learn lessons from it. And any norms, we have a huge normative deficiency because we are disconnected to this history because of our own bias in the way we write history. History should be facts. Facts should be, I would end with E.H. Carr's quotation that facts are sacred, interpretations can vary. But unfortunately, post-independence India, interpretations are sacred and facts vary. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Pandit, for bringing in a lot of, aspects of the forgotten history or something which has not been given due, recognition and importance. I do feel that as far as the maritime dimension of India's strategy is concerned, we have our maritime strategy in place, a doctrine which is in place, so which of course gives us the idea that we are thinking in the right direction. And indeed, we need to, history is written by, people, who have the power and influence to project what they want to project. And it depends. I mean, today, if we see how Britishers have written the history, that is a clear indication of how, certain facts have not been projected the way they should be. And finally, the whole idea of bringing in scholars from different parts of India and giving us the right approach and their own thought process, and not a very Delhi-centric approach that we've seen. So this is one beginning, and I'm sure we will have many such dialogues in future as well. I think we are really short of time. Manish is pressing me that we need to finish by 6:30 for the next panel. So I would just invite our fourth expert and a scholar, Professor Imankalyan Lahiri from Kolkata, Jadavpur University. So Professor, floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry that there is too much sound because I'm still sitting in the university and students are still singing outside. And that is why we face the difficulties sometimes. I sincerely thank Manish, Bhavna, Chair, and all the panelists. And I also thank Professor Pandit, whom I owe a lot because in my last interview, she was there as a panelist, and my regards, Professor Pandit. Now, as Kautilya's Arthashastra is concerned and India's grand strategy is concerned, what is important that Kautilya's Arthashastra basically provides an insight into the ancient Indian anthology of political wisdom. And theory, the art of statecraft is also included in Kautilya's Arthashastra. We teach international relations, and as I understand that when we teach the Morgenthau's theory in the post-1948 world order till date, the realist model of state administration and based on the realist approach, how states are forming the grand strategies cannot be overlooked. Now, it is one of the major political strategic treaties that still has a relevance in the post-liberal era, that constitute a collection of timeless concepts. And that's why more than 2000 years after, we are looking back into history and interpreting Arthashastra in its new form. Now, the importance of the relevance of such strategies, basically the strategies that Kautilya has incorporated in Arthashastra, and the concepts could be enriching to the contemporary world. But what is basically important in the understanding of Kautilya's Arthashastra is that if we just begin with a note or a situation that the revival of the 2003 ceasefire agreement in February 2021 between India and Pakistan, which shows a sign of thaw in the international relation between India and Pakistan after the years of tense relations. Now, it is speculated that it is the result of back-channel talks of officials and pushed by UAE. There is a need to understand this normalization in the context of India's current tense. For example, if we take into account the incidents, what has happened in the Galwan Valley clash of 2020, and also a relation with our northern neighbor, that is China. Now, this scenario provides a great guide regarding approach of the current India's regime, India's foreign policy. And India's foreign policy clearly shows the reflection of the Kautilyan notion of foreign policy or the grand strategy that we should follow in the contemporary years and the years ahead. Now, two important aspects of Kautilya's Arthashastra. One is the mandala theory that Kautilya has developed, and also the Shodguna Siddhant that Kautilya has incorporated in his book Arthashastra. Now, Kautilya has given the mandal Siddhant, which is basically concentric circles showing different mandals. And mandals necessarily means here the circles. And it is based on the view that neighbors are natural enemies. Now, since land is the source of material warfare, neighbors aim to acquire the same piece of land repeatedly. Now, in case of India, if we see Pakistan, if we see China, all aim to acquire the territory of Kashmir by virtue of the abundant resources, as well as its strategic location. Hence, there is bound to be war between India and Pakistan and India and China. Now, in case of China, Arunachal Pradesh can also be added with its claims as its own, what we are facing every day. But now, as per Kautilya's neighbors are natural enemies, and hence they are to be subdued. And to achieve this aim, we sometimes consciously or unconsciously follow or make up a foreign policy incorporating the Sadguna Siddhant, which is the sixfold policy of Kautilya's theory, and which is to be used as per a situation that we follow. For example, the treaty or the Bigraha, the break of a treaty and the start of war, Asan, that stationing of forces near the enemy. And we are following all these aspects repeatedly while making our foreign policy. Now, what important aspect, what we need to do to conceive the grand strategy is the mobilization of troops and joining hand with those having similar aims, which is basically coming or conceptualizing a new theory, which is known as Doibo Bhava. That is the dual policy, that is friendship with one enemy for time and enmity with the other. And if we conceive history, we'll find Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose has followed the same reflection of Kautilya's Mandala theory. Now, if we jump back to the time when India was having tense relations with Pakistan, particularly between 2015 and 2020, we can analyze the trend of our foreign policy. And during that time, we ensured peaceful relations with our neighbors, especially China. It can also be remembered that even during Doklam Valley standoff, when Indian and Chinese soldiers came face to face, conflict was not allowed to exaggerate by both the sides, particularly by the Indian side. Because during that time, Prime Minister Narendra Modi made an informal visit to China, and which led to the emergence of the one spirit to ensure peace at the border. Now, it was taken forward by the visit of Xi Jinping to India, which furthered the relations between India and China. So similarly is the case with Pakistan. It saw the Pulwama terror attack, India's Balakot airstrike, and so on. Here in the above two scenario, we can see the application of Kautilya's policy, more specifically the Dvaiva Bhava, that is the dual policy, that is friendship with one enemy for time and enmity with the other. So we cannot make two enemies together geostrategically, and as far as the geostrategic position of India is concerned, and based on that, we are forming or we are conceptualizing the grand strategy, what government of India or what India's foreign policy makers are thinking about. Now, in the Indo-Pacific also, in the current emerging geopolitical scenario, the Indo-Pacific region has acquired centrality. Its importance is due to the shift of the center of gravity of geopolitics as well as geoeconomics. Here as well, from the Indian side, we can see the application of the Shadguna Siddhant. In this region, we are seeing increasing aggression on part of China, be it in the South China Sea, construction of artificial islands, and so on, manipulation over the Indian Ocean region, etc. Now, its reflection, that is the Shomoshara, that is the joining hand with those having similar aims, can be seen from the Indian side, because India is making the similar friends like Vietnam, Philippines, and so on. Now, by seeing these incidents, we are bound to follow the Kautilya's Mandala theory, because Mandala's theory basically is a plan or blueprint of the expedition with the intention of the world conquest. And if you really want to emerge as a global power in the coming years, we have to follow this particular trend of Kautilya that is incorporated in the Mandala theory. Now, based on the geopolitics and geostrategic assumption, the natural enemy and neighbor's neighbor is your friend. This is very important, what Kautilya has conceptualized. And Kautilya has repeatedly warned against excessive use of contiguous force against internal dissent. Because whenever we use force against the internal dissent, whether it's the farmers' protest, whether stamping of the UAPA in India, some kinds of internal trouble will come up. Yeah, I understand the time is too short. I'll just take two important lines. One is the India's Ori concept, that is the India's enemy. Because if we conceptualize Pakistan, we need to make friends with Afghanistan. So in spite of the Talibanization in Afghanistan, government of India is making hard to have a good contact with the government over there. Now, Kautilya suggested the sovereign to make the peace with the Ori. It is important because during the peacetime, we get the time to secure the need or the required time to enhance our own power or to establish the balance of power. So in the years ahead, in the contemporary years, I wrap up within 1 or 2 seconds, that we need to understand the conceptualization of balance of power. So it's a vast topic. So within 5 to 10 minutes, I have wrapped up what Kautilya wanted to say. But what I feel that it has its relevance, it has its very much importance in the international relations, the study of international relations, what we teach in different universities. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lahiri. And I think you very well concluded that the relevance of Kautilya is something which we cannot ignore. And let me tell you, I'm sure you might have come to IDSA. There's a huge collection of Kautilya's work that is very much there in the library. You could send your students, and that would be helpful. Here, I'm really short of time today, and Manish has just given me a signal that no time for the question. So I have to hand over the platform to Manish to start the next. And my sincere apology to the people who raised hands, but that's not in my control. So Manish, you are to be blamed for not giving more time to the speaker. So there you are. Thank you so much, all the speakers, and it was really very educative even for me. I've learned a lot, and hopefully when we come in the situation where we publish it, we'll have one more debate, and I think that's how we will proceed in future. Thank you, all the panelists, and Manish, over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Meena Roy. I think I really offer my sincere apologies that because of the time constraints we are not able to have a Q&A round, but all the 4 presentations were really very crisp, very concise, and really gave us a flavor. I wish we had more time to have a much deeper conversation, but I'm sure we can do it sometime soon. So with this, I now request Professor Srabani Roy Chaudhury, who is my senior colleague in SIS, to take over the next session. So over to you, Srabani.
Thank you, Manish, and good evening, everybody. For people who have joined in earlier, you realize that we are really working on a very, limited timeline, and we would therefore ask all of you to use the chat box to write your questions such that it can be taken in case we find time after such a strong, lineup that you have for this session on navigating great power politics. We have with us, very fortunate to have Tarun Vijay, Chairman, National Monument Authority and former Member of Parliament. We also have Ruchi Ghanshyam, former Higher Commissioner to UK. So definitely you would be getting a lot of practitioners' viewpoints, as well as Daniel Markey, Senior Advisor South Asia, USIP, and former member of US State Department of Planning staff. A very warm welcome to all the speakers, as well as to the guests who have joined us as audience through the Zoom link. Could I please therefore begin by asking all of you to do some 10 minutes on an opening remark? We would start with Vijay ji.
Thank you very much, and I'm really feeling very honored and privileged to join this very august and distinguished gathering. I was in Washington, D.C. in 2014, early 2014, and was invited as a chief guest in a luncheon meeting by US-India Business Council. That's a very influential think tank, and whenever something happening in India, they do some interactions with the visiting luminaries. Ambassador Stephen Cohen was also fortunately present in that meeting. It was early, a bit very close to the elections. It was the time when most of the Indian so-called secular newspapers, media, especially one magazine that had published a cover story with Modi on the cover page with a headline of a God of Hate. So everyone was in a mood that if Modi comes, something catastrophic would happen to India, and secularism will be destroyed, constitution will be destroyed, and everything would become chaotic. So were the questions at the luncheon meeting in Washington, D.C.'s US-India Council, Business Council meeting. I had about 40-minute presentation on it, and I said that Modi is going to disappoint all the prophets of doom, and India is going to emerge stronger, in a better shape, with better relations with the world powers and neighbors. The questions were very nasty. Many of the questions were very mischievous also, because I had maintained that the United States India desk till that time was dominated by the JNU leftists, who had a very colored vision of India and who loved to hate the Indian glory and the India's progress. At the end of the meeting, Ambassador Cohen came to me and said that, Mr. Vijay, I heard you in rapt attention and I didn't ask a question, but I'm fully optimistic what you said, if it comes true. And if it came true, I'm sorry that he's not now here to see the Modi era in a full form. But after that, in Modi 1 and Modi 2, India's relations with the neighboring countries have completely a new paradigm shift. A new paradigm shift. You can see the Indian Ocean Rim countries. Nobody had been visiting or giving any importance to the great power shift in the Indian Ocean region. Modi saw it. He visited all the Indian Ocean Rim countries, many of the countries where he was the first Indian Prime Minister after 27 years, after 32 years. This was the gap that the previous governments had created, saying hello to your most important, strategically located and strategically very significant countries. In Modi era, we also saw that the world has accepted the Indo-Pacific region. This is our region, Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific region. This region has now come into currency. This word has come into currency. And now people speak about Indo-Pacific region and all the conspiracies and dominating those dreams of China. They have to be stopped. They have to be nipped in the bud with the Quad, with the Malabar exercise with Japan and Australia and USA. So we saw that Modi era not only gave a hope to a new power shift in India, but also to the neighboring countries, the friendly neighboring countries, and to the entire eastern region. They look to India for support, for strength, to standing up against the dominating and the single polar dreams of so-called superpower or emerging superpower. So I think emergence of India as a big power under Modi has been giving hope to the peace-loving people all over the world. And with the recent visit of President Putin, it has again got re-emphasized that we are now a center of hope for those who believe in democracy, who believe in plurality, who believe in the rule of law. This is my 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for starting it off in a right note. I think there would be a lot of questions that we could take off from there. Could I now invite Ma'am Ruchi Ghanshyam, who has been an ambassador in UK, and I'm sure she has a repository of issues that she can bring onto the table. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Srabani Roy Chaudhury. I would, to start with, like to thank Manish Dawadi ji and the Indian Futures for inviting me to this first Indraprastha Grand Strategy Conference and for considering me worthy enough to be in this very eminent panel where we just heard from Shri Tarun Vijay ji, whom we have looked at as a great thinker for a very long time. And on the other hand, we have Daniel Markey, who's again a very renowned, very well-known analyst and thinker. So, I'm left a little bit wondering how I should try to keep up with the brilliance of these people, but nevertheless, I shall make an attempt. So the world, as I think we heard in the from previous speakers, including in the first session, it's going through a very interesting phase. The center of power has become somewhat fluid after a very, very long time, and the configuration of global power and the international system, it is shifting and changing. The Cold War, post-Cold War international system is thus coming to an end. So after a period where the US and the West, Western coalition, they set the norms and they enforce the rules of international behavior. And powers like Russia and China largely acquiesced with whatever was happening around them. The situation is slightly changing, and the global system is again coming to a sharper kind of more explicit great power competition. Russia and China are asserting themselves far more, and the US primacy, along with that of its alliances, is somewhat calmer. And this is kind of a greater assertiveness from China is increasingly visible to everyone, and it's not hidden at all. Western analysts I saw sometimes designated Japan, Germany, Indonesia, and India as aspiring great powers. I'm not sure if I agree with the terminology, but that's another aspect of of the equation, because countries that I just mentioned are also in gaining in prominence in the international arena. Now, the change situation in this era is also a reflection of the changes in the economic situation of the countries concerned. So US, of course, remains the, as per World Bank 2020 statistics, it remains the #1 economy with the GDP of almost 21 trillion. But China is fast catching up at #2 with 14.7 trillion. This is 2020 statistics. Japan, Germany, UK, and India are close to each other, and at times India has gone ahead of UK. So these are the countries that are economically more powerful in terms of their respective GDPs, and so therefore they deserve a greater space in the world power structure. The ranking of the countries, of course, becomes different if we were to look at per capita GDP. But in aging societies of the West, having a low population is not necessarily a major asset. Moreover, when we come to the debt component of the country's economies, then China and Russia, and of course India as well, are better placed as compared to established powers of the world. So great power rivalry is very much a principal theme of current global politics. Now, once we've established that, I think it's important to understand what are the pros and cons. So as I was reading, one of the things I read actually I thought deserved mention. A paper that was in the Texas National Security Review said that great power conflict can be both disconcerting and dangerous. It raises the chance of a major systemic war with, of course, the attendant consequences. So what are systemic wars? A definition that I thought was portrayed it well, explained it well, is that during relatively stable periods, the tensions and conflicts, they manage to be settled, broadly speaking. But the residual tensions, they tend to accumulate. And when they reach a tipping point, countries and people are then prepped for war. Now, in this definition, the Second World War was listed as the fourth systemic war. The other three being the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic War. The First World War was the third systemic war. So the great power conflict, the second consequence of a great power conflict is that it undermines the ability of countries to work together at the multilateral fora. So there are many problems that the world faces, which require more than one country's effort, and it requires actually effort by a group of countries or a large number of countries working together. Now, what could be these, for instance, climate change or terrorism or tensions in certain regions of the world? I mean, things like this require the collaboration amongst countries for the issue to be addressed. But when there is great power rivalry, great power conflict, then the ability of countries to work together comes down, and problems of this nature may not get addressed. In that context, I thought perhaps if one were to look at the lack of physical participation of President Xi and President Putin, both at the G20 summit in Rome and the COP26 summit in Glasgow, might be seen in a slightly different complexion than what one would have generally believed. Of course, that is not necessarily the conclusion, because there's also COVID and other factors that could be in play. Now, another thing which the Texas National Security Review paper said, which I thought was interesting, is that the ideological differences between great powers now are much less than in the Cold War period, but the cleavages between the democratic forces, democratic countries, and the two major authoritarian powers, that cleavage is much deeper and much stronger, and could possibly be a source of conflict. So more than 75 years after the fourth systemic war happened, there seems to be no major threat strong enough to overpower the competition between countries. We don't seem to be bothered, for instance, that a nuclear war or climate change will, make life maybe unlivable in the next whatever few decades. None of that seems to be the major issue of concern, or major enough to calm down the rivalry between powers, the desire of new center of power to take over as the main center of power. Let's put it that way. So that is what was projected in this paper as the source of concern for the future. Now, how is India placed in this scenario? Of course, with the rise of China, there is a fundamental transformation that's happening in the global structural realities. This has, of course, made India to get away from, or to move away from, its historical, hesitation, and work closer with the US and with Western countries. The other implication is, of course, the renewed engagement with the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, which has been mentioned earlier as well. Though I must add here that India is averse to the Quad being projected as a counter-China group. Indian statements have been very clear that India desires to see Quad, India sees Quad rather, as a positive sum, something that where India's capabilities, for instance, could be put to good use, for example, in vaccine production. So, this is one aspect of India's foreign policy that is interesting at the moment. Now, India's partnership with the US and the West is, of course, in my view, also perhaps very little option is there for India at the moment, other than to develop its relationship with the US and the Western countries, and to engage further with the Quad. It's not that China's approach to India is only to be seen in the context of what's happening in the Galwan Valley, because if one were to see long term, the Karakoram Highway, for instance, was started in 1959, and Gwadar Port construction, for example, started in 2001. So the CPEC itself is also a few years old. So it's been going on for over a period of time, but there were other efforts to manage, and the dimensions have changed in the last, let's say, 1 or 2 years, or in the recent past. Now, while India builds its relationship with the West, India is also not forgetting the importance of its long-term partnership with Russia. So in that context, for instance, India has, I think, very clearly understood that it's a very important global balance. Russia is a very important global player for India's, in India's perspective. So this engagement is both pragmatic and I don't think it's totally it's sentimental. So the recent visit of President Putin on 6th of December, which was his first in-person, visit out after the onset of the pandemic. So showing also that Russia itself also understands the importance of relationship with India. And there were important outcomes of from this visit, for instance, the S-400 missiles, and the, proposal for manufacture of 600,000 Kalashnikov rifles. And then last month there was a meeting on Afghanistan, where also India and Central Asian countries participated. And though Russia was initially more supportive of the Taliban than perhaps one could say that India was, but Russia has also seems to have greater understanding and appreciation of India's position on this region. So India has also been sensitive, and that's not just right now, but in the recent past as well as earlier too, on core issues of interest to Russia in the multilateral fora where it comes. India remains conscious of Russia's interests, core interests. So this is the way I think one has to see how India is trying to balance its options and move forward. So this discussion is very timely. I don't know if one can be so pessimistic as to think that a systemic conflict is about to happen in the near future, notwithstanding what some people might say or what it might seem like. I think perhaps one of the things one can see, as in the conversation between President Biden and Putin, is an effort to find find a way to go forward, move forward. I don't know if that is it, but that could be one interpretation. From India's perspective, the growing weight of India in the global order increases its ability to navigate great power politics, and I think this is how, more or less, since I think I'm running out of time, so let me conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Vijay ji, would you like to intervene now or wait for the third speaker to?
I think I will listen to the third speaker and then I will make one comment.
Sure, we'll get back to it then. Thank you. Happy to now introduce David Markle. Could you please give your viewpoints? We've already heard two, and mainly from the Indian perspective. Maybe we'll get some amount of international perspective from David. Over to you, David.
Sure, and to be clear, it's Dan or Daniel, not David.
Extremely sorry, Daniel. I think, sorry. My apologies to everyone. This is Daniel Markle, and he's a senior advisor. Markey to the senior advisor to the South Asian. I have misplaced my glasses today, so I'm having a little.
That's all right. That's all right. It's a real pleasure to see all of you, and I want to thank you. And good morning from the Washington D.C. area. Good evening to nearly all of you, perhaps all of you in India. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel. I want to thank the chair and the other panelists and also the organizers for the opportunity. I am coming from a U.S. perspective, and it was fascinating to listen to the two prior panelists. I think that if I were to try to glean some points of similarity between their remarks, it would be that we're living in a time of extreme change, of global change, of systemic change. And that is certainly central to the broader topic of how to navigate these great power politics that this panel is intended to focus on. I wanted to speak about the opportunities as I see them for India within this context of change and global competition, some of the challenges, and then very briefly, something about the trajectory that India may be on. With respect to opportunities, I hope it doesn't come as a surprise, but India is now more relevant to US global strategy and policy than it has ever been, ever. In the history of the United States, in the history of India, we have never seen this degree of American focus on India, of prioritization of India within US grand strategy. This is certainly true of the Biden administration. It's almost surprisingly true, the extent to which the Biden administration has placed such great emphasis on its relationship with India. There is, of course, some continuity with the prior administration, with the Trump administration. This is not out of nowhere. And the Trump administration drew from its predecessors in the Obama administration and even back to the Bush and before that Clinton administrations in appreciating India's rising importance on the world stage. All of them have gradually come to appreciate the need to conceive of a region now widely described as the Indo-Pacific, whereas the United States used to think of Asia or East Asia. Now we routinely talk about the Indo-Pacific and officially talk about the Indo-Pacific, even in our military planning documents. So there is some continuity from the past. The Biden administration, I've been told, drew directly upon efforts that were ongoing within the Trump administration, for instance, to bring about the Quad virtual summit so soon after the administration began this past March, and then the in-person first ever Quad summit this fall. But there are also some changes within the Biden administration and its view of India and its placement of India in the world, and its view of the nature of the global competition that the United States is engaged in. And I'm sure it won't, again, come as a surprise that the Biden administration, quite unlike the Trump administration, places such great emphasis on this global competition between authoritarian regimes and democratic systems. And of course, this week, we're seeing the Democracy Summit here in Washington, or virtually hosted in Washington. And that is central, I think, to understanding the way that the Biden administration conceives of great power competition. And it's important to appreciate that distinction with the Trump administration, which really focused, you might say, on a more realist or realpolitik view, where the Biden administration sees ideological differences or differences of political structure as being central to understanding this competition. As I say, this is a major opportunity for India. There is a convergence, an unusual convergence of Indian strategic needs and the problem that India faces of Chinese encroachment in its region, in its neighborhood, as well as on its own territory. And the disputes that India has had with China see it in alignment increasingly with the US concerns about China's rise globally and the extent to which China is not just encroaching in one place, say in India, but is moving to assert itself around the world. And in doing so is, in some instances, if not all, threatening what the United States holds dear, which is a rules-based international order founded on certain principles that admittedly have privileged the United States for decades. And the United States sees China's role as threatening that privilege and those rules. And in response, the United States is attempting multiple efforts or multiple lines of effort to balance and respond to China. Internal balancing, that is, the United States is attempting to make itself more capable and more competitive and to protect its economy in ways that historically have been less true. We now talk some about decoupling in strategic industries, questions about China's involvement in the American high-tech sector and other sectors. The United States is seeing China as a competitor, whereas once it focused more on cooperative ventures. The United States is responding by external balancing as well. And the Biden administration especially is working to shore up traditional alliances around the world. And then, as we see with India, to build out new partnerships and to expand those partnerships and expand alliances and expand their activities in ways that are very clearly directed toward meeting this challenge posed by China. Okay, so India in all of this has an opportunity because its interests and the US interests are more in alignment than we have historically seen. But it also faces challenges. And, in one sense, if you look at strategic alignments, not just about China, but about other countries and about the way India sees the world and about the way the United States sees the world, on the one hand, you could say it's better than ever. We have alignments that did not used to exist in our understanding of relations with countries like Israel, where India has become increasingly close and the United States has enjoyed a long and close relationship, or the UAE, another example where we are more or less in alignment. And we have also come to find that we are less out of alignment on countries like Iran, where our concerns may be more similar than they were in the past. Also, you could say that a major stumbling block in US-India relations in past history was Pakistan. But the deterioration in US-Pakistan relations, the frustration certainly evidenced by the Biden administration's interactions with Pakistan, is not identical to India's concerns and frustrations with Pakistan, but is reinforcing of them, and is certainly less out of alignment than we saw even a decade ago. However, there are other areas where we are not in alignment, and Russia, of course, is at the top of the list. here India faces a challenging act, navigating a relationship with Russia on which it depends for defense supplies, as was pointed out earlier, of all types, both high-tech and low-tech. At the high end, S-400 missile defense system, the low end, rifles. India cannot meet its defense needs cheaply and effectively without purchasing from Russia, it seems. The United States understands that and yet still finds it deeply troubling, given the nature of the hostility that the United States faces from Russia and the concerns that the United States faces about Russian hostility in Eastern Europe. Also, India faces a challenge because Russia is not simply supplying its weapons to India. It's not a simple or singular bilateral relationship, but China is also benefiting from Russian equipment. The same S-400 systems that India is eager to purchase from Russia have already been purchased by China. Other high-tech systems are being purchased from Russia by China. By continuing to be looped into the Russian military ecosystem or system of military industrial production, India is also finding itself in a problematic place as it seeks to compete with China. And then finally, there's clearly an increasing China-Russia strategic connection that India will find challenging to bridge and will see itself squeezed between if it's not careful. Okay, so that's one area, Russia. And another, very briefly, would be Afghanistan, where the US withdrawal from Afghanistan has left a gaping security and humanitarian hole in India's broader neighborhood, and which will be problematic for India and difficult to manage, and which the United States, I have to say, frankly, at the moment, has little patience for and few solutions for, unfortunately. There may be also areas where India and the United States have different strategic priorities. And this isn't so much differences, but it's a degree of interest that they attach to various aims. And one of these, I think, has come up over the past couple of years as India has struggled in defending its border against China, its land border. There is a question here about the relative strategic significance of India's land concerns with respect certainly to China, but also to Pakistan, as compared to its maritime concerns. And as the United States has looked at India historically, I mentioned the Indo-Pacific is a very current term of art here in the United States. That suggests a maritime priority, which is mirrored throughout US global interests, but especially in Asia, where our strength is at sea. And our perception of India as a valuable strategic partner has typically been linked to India's privileged geographical position with respect to the sea, to the Indian Ocean, the dominant perch that it enjoys over the Indian Ocean, and not on land. And yet India is pulled in two directions here as well, and will struggle to do both at the same time in a cost-effective way. All right, last point as I wrap up about India's trajectory. Of course, it's impossible to predict what direction India is going, but we can say that it has been growing. It has been growing in a material sense, and it has been growing in its ambition. Even the nature of this conference today suggests a greater global ambition on India's part, intellectually and in a policy sense as well. Years ago, I wrote a piece about India's software for foreign policy, its capacity to think and plan for a global foreign policy. And I would say that if in the intervening years, it's been almost 15 years since that piece came out, we have seen considerable attention to India's software, its intellectual infrastructure. Think tanks like this one and many others have cropped up in New Delhi and in other cities in India, and suggest, as I say, a broader and capability for thinking about the world. there's much more that India can do, many more investments in these areas, area studies, understanding the region and the world, and functional issues more deeply and effectively. Of course, that same thing can be said about China or even the United States, where we've been acting as a superpower for many decades now. So there's more that can be done, but I think I've seen considerable growth in that area. It's on the hard power trajectory where I think there are still grave concerns about India's trajectory. Not that India isn't growing, but that China is growing so much more rapidly and has grown so much more rapidly suggests serious concerns about India's capacity, not to match China, but even to keep pace. And I'm struck by just the story told in simple GDP figures, some of which were already mentioned. But if we go back to 2009, we see China with a GDP of roughly $5 trillion, the United States something over 14 trillion, and India in the 1.2 trillion. 10 years later, China had nearly tripled its GDP to over 14 trillion. The United States had not kept pace and was only at around 21 trillion. India, though, had doubled its GDP to 2.8 or so trillion, but even in that doubling, had lagged further and further behind China. That is the core problem that India faces in navigating great power politics and its place within the great power system. It is hard power, and it is difficult to see what India's solution to that problem is, but I would suggest that that needs to be at the center of Indian planning and strategy going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for laying out such, eruditely the opportunities and challenges that India faces with respect to the great power competition. I would like to open the floor for questions while I'll ask Vijay ji to come in with his interventions that he would like to make before we carry this.
Thank you, Srabani. I have heard with rapt attention the great scholars who have deliberated here on India's trajectory, and they have, especially Daniel, looked a bit not very optimistic about what India is achieving these days, and that's no surprise to me. The Americans are in the habit of looking at India with a bit negative approach, and they are unable to comprehend and identify and recognize the great decolonization that's happening in India under Modi's leadership. More than economic achievements, more than defense achievements, more than any other infrastructural achievement, I think the decolonization of mind and policy is at the core of Modi's themes in every sphere. And that is what the Americans must understand. I remember when I was on a scholarship to America, I was taken to Pennsylvania. And there I saw that, well, also many people in India won't understand what 4th July means to America and what 4th July, why is it called the American Independence Day? Because the Declaration of Independence was held on 4th July. Why? They won a war against the Great Britain. They were not fighting against Saudi Arabia. They were not fighting against any other power. And several colonies became one. Has America been able to follow those ideals of Thomas Jefferson, King, or Lincoln today? That's the question. India is now first time showing that India will grow on her own sinews. Decolonizing the mind and decolonizing the policies means we do not belong to any camp, neither US nor Russia. We are in our own orbit of India and see what kind of struggles that we are facing. On the one hand, we see that the Americans have always been supporting the most psychophine autocrats and the dictatorships in the world, whether they are Saudis or whether Pakistan or whether Afghanistan. Look what they did in Afghanistan. It's completely a stab in the back of democracy. And they never took what they say in inverted commas, their best strategic ally, India, into confidence. What happened in Kabul was completely came as a shock to us, and we were looking at Washington. What have you done here? This is what they do to the democracies, and this is what they love to work with the despots. First time under Narendra Modi, India has shown that India will progress on her own strength. Vocal for local, defense manufacturing in India. In a situation, Charbani, these guys don't understand that India is fighting several wars simultaneously, funded by the foreign money. We are fighting a war in Manipur. And what's the terrorist organization in Manipur called? People's Liberation Army. That's a proscribed terrorist organization in Manipur that follows the Chinese ideals. They get money from there. Naxals, the communist terrorism in India, is the biggest threat to democracy, constitutionalism, and plurality, which the romanticized people love to say Naxalism or Maoism. That's a pure communist terrorism. The third is jihadi terrorism. And the other is this Pakistan-supported, Chinese-supported Naxals and these PLA kind of a people. Along with this is the Pakistani intervention and the Chinese intervention in Doklam and Galwan. India, first time after independence, they stood very firm and gave a big push to Chinese, and they had to stay back in their pajamas. In Galwan, today, unfortunately, we saw the last rites and the last farewell to a great Chief of the Defense Staff, General Bipin Rawat. It was General Rawat. China was afraid of General Rawat. In Doklam, we have given a befitting reply. Befitting reply, some is said, some is unsaid to Chinese. This is happening under Modi. Modi, while fighting several wars simultaneously, did Kashmir turn into Union territory and saved Ladakh from Kashmir's interventions. Secondly, they said that the economy will go down. In Manmohan Singh's time, the highest level of foreign investment achieved was never crossed $25 billion. It was in the vicinity of $21 or $22 billion. Under Modi, in spite of COVID, in spite of so many wars fighting simultaneously, we have achieved a foreign investment of $89 billion today. And it's growing. They said that the business is going down. They have, with the foreign funding, created so many fake agitations. But what happened during Diwali? We had a business of 1.25 trillion rupees. So under Modi, the paradigm shift is with democracy, with plurality, with constitutionalism, and with decolonization of mind, we can achieve greater heights. We can achieve friendship with everyone, and we can teach lesson to the unrepentant, wicked neighbors. So I think we are doing great. It's a new paradigm, and Modi is now a global leader of those who believe in the genuine democracy, in the genuine constitutionalism, in the genuine pluralism. In America, no non-Christian can ever dream to become president. It's only in India they dream and they do it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Manish, you had some question to follow up by.
Thank you, Srabani. I mean, all excellent presentations. So I just have a very quick question. Ashley Tellis, in fact, reviewing Dr. S. Jaishankar's book, The India Way, put it out as a title that India non-allied forever. So do you think that is going to be the India way, that India will not be firmly in any camp? And in fact, is that a problem for the Americans? That because Americans are used to having close relationships, formal alliances. So to what extent will that play out in the months and years ahead? So maybe Ambassador Ghanshyam or Professor Markey could answer that. And Professor Markey, I think, was brilliant also in talking, pointing out very clearly that ultimately hard power, accumulation of hard power is going to be very crucial for India's great power politics, for navigating this great power politics. Tarunji also pointed out the other side of the story that India is definitely making a very significant shift in that direction, but obviously it is not going to be a smooth ride, and obviously with all problems at our borders. So maybe both of them could respond. This whole allied non-forever, allied forever, non-allied forever, is that going to be the way ahead for India, India's foreign policy?
Yes, ma'am. Would you like to react to this question?
Thank you so much. That's an interesting question, and I think perhaps our thinking is similar in the sense that in my presentation, that's what I was trying to actually bring out. That in response to the emerging scenario and in response to the prevailing global situation, India is on the one hand building its relationship with the US and with the Western countries, but at the same time also working to build the Quad, build its engagement with the Quad, while simultaneously maintaining its long-term, time-tested relationship with Russia. So I think this is the balance that, because I kind of rushed the conclusion a little bit, this is the balance that I was trying to point out, that this is how India is trying to balance its way forward. India is too proud and too proud a nation, too strong a nation to just be somebody's ally. That's my personal opinion. And having said that, I think the US, as Daniel Markey also pointed out, also seems to have, though it may not agree with everything, but there's also understanding and appreciation, I think, in the US of India's, situation, India's priorities, India's needs. So I think I'll leave it to him to expand further on that. But I think that's what that's exactly the point that I was trying to conclude with in my presentation. Thank you.
David, would you like to react?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. It's a great question, and it's at the core of certainly a lot of U.S. thinking and questioning. It comes to the issue of the potential for strategic relations with India. How high is the ceiling in that relationship? And Indians are right to see the United States as being used to having allies and comfortable with junior allies, particularly since it's been a superpower over the past century. And in those relations, it being very clear who's in charge and who is the follower. And our NATO partners and some of our other treaty allies in Asia are very important to the United States, but are clearly allies, but also junior allies. And India doesn't fit neatly into that. And the ambassador is right. Americans are struggling to understand that and make sense of it. But what is the consequence of this? Non-aligned forever may well be true, but it will come at some strategic cost to India. And that's what India has to grapple with. I think, this is undetermined, but these are the decisions that India will have to make. And I will make a very clear example of this. The United States just recently made a new defense agreement that includes the UK and Australia, the so-called AUKUS agreement, in which the plan is to, over time, provide Australia with the technologies, sensitive technologies associated with nuclear propulsion of submarines. That is something that is available to Australia and has been available to the UK because they are not just strategic partners, but treaty allies of the United States. Junior allies, yes, but treaty allies. That is strategically relevant to Australia and will be valuable to it in, I think, considerable ways over time. That is a technology that in strategic partnership, India will not enjoy from the United States. That's India's decision. But as I said before, India faces a massive and unfortunately growing gap in its hard power capabilities with China. And so as it's struggling to close that gap in a sense, or address the implications of that gap, it will have to make hard decisions. But those are India's decisions, not ours. And we are well aware of that. And while we may struggle with it being a bit uncomfortable or awkward or different, that's the reality. So we will live with it.
Thanks. Dr. Singh, you have raised your hand, so you can go ahead with your question. Could someone unmute her, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I have a question to Mr. Daniel. Now, this is regarding the region which is very, very crucial for us, the West Asia, or what you call Middle East. The Russians have proposed a new, collective security proposal of the security architecture, which they would want to probably build in collaboration with the major players, wherein India, US, China, everybody becomes a part of it. How would you react to this, and what are your views on this particular, proposal? Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize. I don't feel that I've followed it closely enough to give you fine-grained, but I'll give you some immediate reactions. The first would be that big picture, and I'm sure you're aware, but the realities, the strategic realities, the geopolitical realities of the Middle East are unfolding and changing so rapidly over the past 5 years, and have been overwhelmingly defined by turmoil and change for the past 20 years, that it's very difficult to say that, this looks like another chapter in an unfolding story that certainly isn't going to end anytime soon. But if you were to see a through line, or try to find a line throughout this, it's the rise and fall of American attempts to manage or control what's going on in the Middle East. And we are in the decline part. And I don't imagine, I think the key point here is, I don't imagine us attempting to go back in, certainly not in the ways that we have seen in the past, and maybe not even in narrower, just strictly diplomatic ways. And so that creates an opening for whether it's Russia or perhaps in the future China or others to play a greater leadership role in the region to try to grapple with what are continuing problems of governance and lead to instability and insecurity that can easily go beyond the region. So that's the structural aspect to it. In terms of reactions, though, purely diplomatically on the ground, you cannot imagine that the United States is going to see with great favor Russian initiatives, not in the Middle East and not elsewhere, not even in Afghanistan. Why? Because behind every Russian initiative right now, we have become accustomed to seeing Russia essentially create problems for us. So it's not purely a desire to bring together order or stability on Russia's part, but to poke the Americans in the eye and to cause us discomfort. So that there will be skepticism here in the United States is something that you can also take for granted as this maybe progresses. It won't be greeted with joy or warmth. Just to put a final point here, the US-Russian relationship needs to find a stable equilibrium for so many other things in the world to begin to resolve, including the US-India relationship. It's an irritant, an important one, in that relationship. And so, I don't know if we have to wait. This is going to sound terrible. If we have to wait till we see a post-Putin Russia for that to begin to happen, but it may well be. And so we're in for a rough ride until then. He seems pretty healthy.
Thank you. Manish, I think I've earned my keep by doing a good job of finishing this 1 minute later than what you had given us. But interestingly, you all must have realized that this subject of great power competition and navigating the great power competition for India is probably the critical area of concern right now. Post-Cold War, we have seen the focus moving towards alignment and allied way of doing things. But currently, with the kind of ecosystem that is originating because of the COVID issues that has been put forward in the international platforms, seems to seek answers not from the great power, but probably aligning of the second tier, or what is often being put in the narrative as middle powers, in a way such that they ensure that the great powers find equilibrium and competition, live in a good competitive world, is probably what would be the future of India Futures discussions in the near future. Thank you, all the eminent speakers who have joined us. Vijay ji has left us, unfortunately. Thanks to Vijay ji also for beautifully putting across what he looks at India's positioning. Thank you, Bam, for giving us a critical evaluation of past and the present system that has been originating, and Daniel coming over and giving us excellent understanding of how we would, America would be facing, and therefore challenges and opportunities for India. And my sincere apologies to you to have misspelled your name in the beginning. I'm extremely sorry for that. And thank you, audience, for listening in. And I now hand it over to Manish to take over the next session. Thank you, Manish, again. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Professor Srabani, and thanks to all the earlier speakers, distinguished speakers. Each of them, I think, beautifully brought out in a very concise way, what sort of challenges, what sort of opportunities India would have in navigating great power politics. So thanks again for all those brilliant remarks. So we now move to the next session. This is session 3. And I have the fortune of moderating that, and this is on emerging global economic frontiers. So that's the title of this session, and we have with us very important, very eminent thinkers who are going to guide us on what exactly the session is. So we have with us Shri Tanmay Chakraborty, who has decades of corporate experience. He is now Group Government Affairs Officer, Tata Sons Private Limited. We also have with us Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, who is the DG of RIS and India's foremost development economist, and in fact regularly seen in various national and international media and think tanks, profusely writing, profusely giving lectures. Unfortunately, Professor Amrita Narlikar couldn't join us today because of some unavoidable circumstances, but we have really a power punch with these two with us. And before I hand over to, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, in fact, he also has made a request that he would like to come in first, as he has to attend some international meeting after 8. So I would just like to flag some questions, I think, which need serious answers, and I'm sure both eminent speakers will really reflect on those questions. The number one is that are we seeing in a serious sense an end of globalization, or is it going to be or what we are witnessing is actually gated globalization? So where exactly is the needle shifting? The second key question, I think, is this whole sudden nationalist impulses which are also creeping into economic domain. So you have the America First, you have Atmanirbhar Bharat, Make in India. So where are we actually heading? The third, and I think a very important question, is about this whole weaponization of economic interdependence. And I think that is an area where some serious thought has to be given, both by the government, by the state, and even by the private corporate sector. That to what extent is decoupling, and which has been talked about, is really possible, because the moment you bring in other than commerce trade considerations, it is going to impact negatively on global economic trade. The other important question is, where I think we need to be finding answers, is now that economics and trade is now purely political. It has really become very political, and obviously not many are speaking openly, but it is about containing China. It is about diversifying your global supply chains. So to what extent, again, is that going to affect the India's economic diplomacy from the state point of view, and from the corporate point of view, that how are the corporates looking at the whole scene? And obviously the last one obviously is about technology. To what extent are we entering a technology deterministic world, an economic future where ultimately who really gets ahead in the technology race? It can be 5G, it can be AI, it can be advanced computing, semiconductors. So I think, is that going to really decide our each one of us economic future? So I think with this, I just laid out the broader questions any foreign policy analyst would be thinking or trying to find answers to. So with this, now I invite Professor Sachin Chaturvedi to speak largely on India's economic diplomacy, but also try to answer some of these questions. Over to you, Professor Sachin.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Manishi, for very exhaustive initial remarks. And I must say, you have covered a large canvas. I think it's absolutely essential for us to begin from where you left. And I think any kind of consideration that we may have on India's economic diplomacy, or the very idea of globalization, its direction, its content, probably would bring in issues which are relevant to technology. Technology is going to be the fulcrum for future, and you're absolutely not there when you say it is going to determine the interdependence and weaponization of that. The idea of weaponization of weather and weather-related predictions, the idea of weaponizing monsoon and its flow, are issues which we discussed during COP26. But weaponizing technology for access is something which is extremely important. I think future economic diplomacy endeavors would crucially depend on access to technology, ability to leverage technology for development, ability to bring in innovation, which would bring in development. And that, I think, for countries which are at different stages of economic development, it's extremely important. Manish, we just did a study at RIS where we focused on India-China trade, and we found that India is importing something like 4,444 commodities, and these commodities contribute to a huge range of deficits which we have with China. But out of that, we found 327 products, only 327 products, which contribute to 78% of India's trade deficit with China. And if you remove 5 products, which only steel industry imports from China, the products constitute something like 74%. And out of 74%, almost 65% of these products are actually intermediate products. So our dependence on China for final products is very, very limited. So what point I'm trying to drive is that you are entering in a zone which is interdependent. It is interdependent. It depends on intermediate products. The ability of India to do away with final products as our imports from China is over. And this is what we need to realize. We need to realize the fact that more and more countries are now getting into that zone, particularly economies like India, where inputs from imports for our exports is growing. We are entering in a phase of economic development where these growing interdependence are important. And in our study led by Professor Mohanty and his team at RIS, they have demonstrated that we can easily do the import substitution that is needed in terms of switching over to other suppliers. So import substitution vis-a-vis China, and not to do away with the imports per se. And we have identified 17 countries in each of the product categories of 323 products, because steel that we are discussing very closely with some of the officials across private sector and those who are dealing with steel. And I'm very glad that we have Mr. Tanmoy here in the panel to further supplement. And Ms. Aruna Sharma and her team are working very closely with us in terms of identifying. We had discussions at various quarters to see how we do the diversification of sources of imports for India for those 323 products. In each category, we have identified 17 countries. So the short point, Dr. Manish, is about our ability to see economic diplomacy excel over many of the choices that we may not have. So the new dimension of economic diplomacy cannot be led by government alone. It requires deep research and evidence-based analysis. It requires a full appreciation of industry's requirements and industry's partnership for evolving policy responses. Unfortunately, in several of our last several years, we have never tried that. It is in last 3-4 years, more concerted efforts are being made by the government to bring economic diplomacy upfront. And that's where the credit to Prime Minister Modi goes in terms of identifying these priority areas and pushing the frontier further in terms of convergences that are needed. And these convergences are important, both in terms of we identifying the priority areas, but also in terms of we encouraging greater think tank, industry, government partnership for a composite response to the kind of challenges our import-dependent industry is facing till we go further. This also requires bringing in institutions like the Reserve Bank of India and other banking and financial institutions to facilitate financing of those sectors which hitherto we saw as priority area, but now the priority area is changing. And this is what, as a board member in the Reserve Bank, I have been articulating that you need to change frontier technology intensity that we need to redefine the priority sectors. Priority sectors which were defined in 90s are no more valid. We have changed the nature and we have changed the nature of interdependence and partnership. So that I think is important. My second point, Manish, comes out more from technology. And technology, I think, is immensely important for us to see how some countries have undermined the norms and the direction in which technologies are being developed. Whether it is the question of producing synthetic babies out of a synthetic biology, or undermining the red lines for outer space and cybersecurity, jumping in 5G and monopolizing 5G related endeavors, they require a response which Quad countries have extended. The statement in March 2021 by the Quad countries on technology cooperation, technology partnership, I think is extremely important. And we need to reiterate that as part of India's economic diplomacy when it comes to we understanding the question that you raised about nature of globalization. Nature of globalization would depend on like-minded countries, countries which are driven by democracy, the idea of freedom, and idea of partnership. And those like-minded countries would determine how the global partnerships would come up when we are talking about these interdependencies. The idea of bringing in green hydrogen, the idea of bringing in nanotechnology and the frontier technologies like biotech and its convergence with ICT would depend on our idea of how we look at the norms that are essential for R&D trajectory, for financing of R&D, and also for its outcomes. So economic diplomacy would be largely determined by these norms. If there is a blind race for resource extraction and producing endlessly for expansion, that is no more compatible with COP26 commitments or what people are now preparing for COP27. So sustainability is a crucial fulcrum on which economic diplomacy depends. And that requires our efforts in terms of analyzing it further and taking it forward in terms of how we go with partnerships and with the ideas that are there. My third point is a response to your observation of rise in nationalist tendencies. As I said, technology development, intermediate product dependence, these are trends which do not allow nationalist tendencies to go very far. We are in an interdependent world. We are in a world where countries with like-minded commitments do not allow nationalist forces to close borders. India's idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat is not to close borders. India's idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat is to produce and engage people. It's part of India's strategy for localization of development. It's part of our idea of Agenda 2030, which is to maintain the commitment for sustainability, sustenance of lives and livelihoods. And that, Manish, is important for us to see how we bring in various actors together. The countries which are grappling at different development trajectories have the space, the national maneuvering space for job creation. It is not for free dumping of goods into others' territories at low cost and cost which are unsustainable for many countries. Hitherto, only least developed countries and developing countries which were committing themselves for protectionist tendencies like the closing of borders. But now you see even in Europe, US, and many other countries, they see the importance and the point that we have been making about self-reliance. But within the country, self-reliance is not about state of Karnataka growing apples and Himachal Pradesh growing rice or wheat. No, it's not that. It's about complementarity. It is about supplementing each other's efforts. So we are not saying that each state would become independent, each bloc would become independent. That is not sustainable. What is sustainable, what is in tune with environmental requirements, that is what determines the idea of the partnership to address issues which are significant in terms of our engagement. So that dimension, I think, is extremely important. The new ideas and new frameworks which are needed, I think, is the point that you mentioned about what kind of positioning of trade we need. And I think that's where some defining principles are extremely important. We have already said, and Prime Minister Modi was extremely clear in terms of neighborhood first policy. And this is the idea with the idea of Act-East policy is something which is going to take us forward. And and it is knocking within the country and now at the international level of Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI. Both ISA and CDRI and in this, these are global public goods. So Manish, you can appreciate the point that only North was creating global public goods, but economic diplomacy, economic requirements now are going in the direction where countries like India are also contributing to global public goods. And it's dimension of our new foreign policy, which is giving heft and bandwidth to diplomacy, which one may classify as economic diplomacy, but is very much part of our international responsibility. I think if we look into the engagements that are there, the development cooperation assistance from India has played an important role in economic diplomacy. The idea of South-South cooperation is a crucial fulcrum for many years, which we have been addressing. Since 2015, this government has introduced the idea of e-Pragati, timely completion of India's projects and completion of projects with quality. Now there are discussions how we reform our lines of credit, whether we can form a development partnership administration into a development partnership board to bring in other ministries and other entities. There is discussion whether India requires a new, if I can say, aid agency, though I do not believe in the word aid. I always write that India does not give aid, India is development partner, because it's a question about equality. So we are not donors, we are give aid, we give development partnership and development assistance. So if India has to have that aid agency, what should be its mandate, what it should look like, and how it can engage with partner countries in the way that is needed. And from that point of view, I think it is also important for us to understand the whole concept of economic diplomacy, which has several facets and at theoretical level. If you see Hedgeman's and Hedgeman's own work of 2011 has identified several contours of this. In fact, in one of the tables in his paper, and I think in one of my books, I have captured this of commercial diplomacy, trade diplomacy, financial diplomacy, inducements and sanctions. All the 5 components are seen as part of tools for economic diplomacy. Both China and the United States have freely leveraged these instruments for various purposes. Sam, Dam, Dand, Bhed, all they capture precisely this Indian idea. And whether you talk about sanctions, inducements, financial diplomacy, trade diplomacy, and commercial diplomacy, all 5 bring out this fact quite well. And they actually have been leveraged. There are several papers which have captured this. But when we talk about roadmap for India, we are seeing these dimensions from opportunities that Kaka Kalelkar and others articulated at some point. But I think Prime Minister Vajpayee was the first one who thought of leveraging the strength of expats. And Pravasi Bharati Divas that we started celebrating from 2016 onward, the push that Sushma ji gave to it, and I think Prime Minister himself is directly engaged. It has provided the new bandwidth to our economic diplomacy. We are seeing them as our partners. They are seeing them not as somebody who came for gold in 1991, but we are seeing them as partners with our future development endeavors. And that's where the relevance of development impact comes in, capacity building comes in. And this work at RIS, in terms of theorizing India's development cooperation, we have identified 5 modalities. And all development cooperation can be divided into 5 modalities. We call that as, Ambassador Amar Sinha called it as Panchamrit. And that brings in the idea of capacity building, as you see under ITEC and many other initiatives, the idea of technology transfer, the idea of concessional finance that you see through lines of credit, the grant element, and of course, the duty-free, quota-free access. So these 5 modalities provide the bandwidth for our engagement and the evolving narrative on India's development cooperation and partnership. It is also important for us to see how India's economic diplomacy and engagement at wider level connects with the global efforts. I already talked about Quad, but I think it's also important to see how multilateral institutions come in. India has contributed several millions of dollars to the IPSA Trust Fund. IPSA Trust Fund is India-Brazil, South Africa partnership. We have collectively now $48 million for 32 projects which have been implemented in 48 countries. And these countries have all bandwidth within the least developed countries. We are also trying to see how we connect with the UN Office on South-South cooperation and provide the issues that are there. The issues which are related to ocean governance with our emphasis on monsoon prediction. Ministry of Earth Sciences has been providing the support to several countries in Indian Ocean as part of India's engagement with the Indo-Pacific to support them. The idea of climate change in Fiji and many other small island countries, more and more support is being extended as part of SDG Goal 14, which is about ocean governance. Our contribution for peacekeeping, just an effort in terms of development cooperation and partnership. But it is also in terms of peace. Nepal or Sri Lanka, Maldives or Afghanistan. Pakistan is a perpetual to regional peace. I think we require economic diplomacy to be expanded, and we require peace to be brought in the idea of economic prosperity. Today, India is developing, India is expanding. We are leapfrogging in many areas because we have peace and we have tranquility and harmony within the country. So I think economic diplomacy brings in this larger concept and is extremely important for us, particularly those who are into IR, to realize that science, technology, peacekeeping, innovation, technology with finance and banking, they all are important facets of economic diplomacy. They would have to be leveraged and should be leveraged whenever the opportunity comes in. Fortunately, in the last 5 or 6 years, we have continuously leveraged each one of them for collective benefit and gain. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chaturvedi. I think you really brilliantly mapped out a very multi-layered, very multifocal sort of challenges, the scenarios, and also opportunities for India. And in fact, obviously, talking about how India takes its economic diplomacy much more seriously. So we have the e-Pragati, which is very important, and also this, in fact, you would also remember that, and which is actually very surprising, that India's economic diplomacy website was launched only December 2020. I mean, it is such a slow state. I mean, in that sense, the progress, the importance had to be much more, which we are seeing now in the current government. So I think that is a welcome change. And obviously, in fact, I'm very happy that you frontally took on all the questions which were posed for this session, talking about weaponization of economic technological interdependence. And also, I think there is so much confusion about supply chains. And I think you rightly pointed out that Atmanirbhar Bharat is not about import substitution. It is more about diversifying India's supply chains. It is more about substituting China for very obvious reasons. And I think the most important point where Tanmoyji, we would like him to hear also that India's economic diplomacy cannot be government-led alone. It has to involve, in a much more serious way, what sort of economic industry partnerships. So, to what extent is there a very serious collaboration, a very serious give and take in terms of ideas, in terms of concepts? And in fact, Tanmoyji, when I met Tanmoyji on this conference, uh, uh, he was very right in saying that, in fact, the corporate world, the corporate sector has been much ahead in terms of economic projection abroad, and also the corporates have in fact shown the way to even the government, especially in the IT sector. This whatever IT revolution, digital India we see, in that and to some extent, I think the corporate sector has really shown us the way. The other point, and I think which is the last important point which you flagged for us, was about how values and norms are ultimately going to guide our economic partnerships. And I think that's a very important point. But to what extent will that affect our because ultimately trade or economics is driven by a very different logic of market, of profits. So if we are looking at the question of values, how will that play out in the longer run, I think needs to be closely addressed. So thank you, Professor Sachin, for this very wonderful, very insightful talk, and hope to see you soon in person whenever it's possible. So with this, I now invite Tanmoyji to. In fact, I was just, as I was mentioning earlier, he is really a bundle of raw energy, and the moment you talk to him, you listen to him, you feel so inspired. And obviously, because he has a wealth of experience dealing with government, dealing with the private sector, dealing with international markets. And I think that is what I think. So his perspective is really going to add substantial value to our understanding of changing global economic frontiers, because ultimately, what is India's story? The India story is really about the corporate victories abroad, the corporates. It's really a corporate success story of Tatas, of the Ambanis, of the Adanis. And I think that is where somewhere we need to understand that these are really Indian enterprises making their mark globally, and we need to celebrate them, and we really have to appreciate how they are going about it. So over to you, Tanmoyji.
Thank you very much, Manish, for having me here this evening. I have been listening very interesting set of conversations, and the previous session, made me ponder for a moment that, I think the single most complicating factor in the world today that we have is the human being. Because here we are as a world going through literally a war through the COVID pandemic, and yet the complexities of, boundaries, jurisdictions, countries, and not looking at the people of the world as one, but looking at people as different, economically, intellectually, it came out so clearly in the previous session, which was, of course, political in nature. And, politics is something that can complicate people's lives. If you look at the aspirations of the average people around the world, they are so far different from the way the leadership in the world treats the people of the world, who actually bring these leaders onto power. For them, it is that the entire world went through a war without a single bullet which got fired, which did not consume a single piece of the whole stockpile of weaponry, for which many other sectoral sacrifices have been made by all the countries who are going after spending billions of dollars on, weaponizing themselves. Against what? And it didn't take any single bullet to actually, the world face this entire pandemic, which led to millions of lives being lost and the entire economic disaster that faced the average people, the simple people, the daily wage workers. So it just sometimes makes me ponder that at what cross purposes does the global leadership drive the rest of humanity? Really sometimes makes me wonder. And I'm being absolutely candid about my observations before I start this session is, instead of learning lessons from the pandemic to be able to reorganize humanity, to be able to become more closer and helpful to each other, we are seeing all of these islands of thinking and hardening of borders taking place, which is just not helping the situation at all. So I think it's something to introspect for the whole group that is listening to us today, is something to make us ponder that whereas are we on the path of self-destruction, or are we really learning lessons from the deeply infected pain that has been brought upon us as humanity, which has completely constrained and restricted our day-to-day lives of average people. And instead of getting to become one to consolidate ourselves to fight this, we are still in our archaic thinking of a highly polarized world where somebody wants to be the elder ally of the other, etc., etc. So just wanted to share some of these thoughts and observations from the previous section. Coming to our topic, I think we have to look at it in two parts, Manish. One is, what is it that we are doing in India to emerge economically? I think I will kind of balance it into two parts, my time that I have. And the first thing is, I think India has bitterly learned from the pandemic. I mean, you have seen the en masse exodus of urban population, working population, mostly daily wage labor population, going back to the villages. You have seen the massive slumification that we have done in all our cities, and the high inequality that exists today and it's really, people are on the brink between the absolutely superlatively affluent versus the almost struggling daily subsistence mass of people. And this kind of inequality is stark, and we are going to be 50% urbanized in India by 2030. And we are not even conceiving any greenfield cities. And therefore, that means we are putting pressure on all our existing cities, and that's definitely bursting all our cities at its seams. So de-slumification, the issue of urban low-cost housing, the issue of mass transportation chaos that we witness and experience on a day-to-day basis in urban transportation, the issue of inadequate health facilities, the issue of cleaning up of our rivers, cleaning up of the issue of 76% of disease in India, which is resultant from people drinking questionable quality of water as a basic expectation. These are some of the issues, if I can put them, which are priorities for India to sort out for itself. So there is a tremendous focus on core infrastructure, as you can see from the government in terms of prioritization of the infrastructure fund and the priority that our Prime Minister gives to not only urban infrastructure, but also rural infrastructure in terms of the Awas Yojana and the ability to provide housing for people for 60, 70, 100 years living in hutments. So basic amenities, sewage, clean drinking water, healthcare facilities, these are enough economic activities in the country that is going to keep India busy within its borders. And that's where I clearly see the prioritization being accorded by the government, a lot of public-private partnership initiatives coming up in these sectors. And that's exactly what we are going to be busy with. I sometimes always, not sometimes, but I always am convinced that the West have solved the problem of the first billion people in the world. And it is for countries like us, India, who have to work to solve the problem of the other 5 or 6 billion people because we can relate to the other 5 or 6 billion people in terms of the developmental trajectory that 5 or 6 billion people have or are experiencing on a daily basis around the world, around the developing world. So I think definitely there is a lot of innovation. There is a lot of focus on cost and quality in all that we are building for our country, whether it is the road system, whether it is the rejuvenation of the rail system, the 100 airports to create a hub and spoke for the airport and the air travel infrastructure, whether it is the several aims and so many other prioritized initiatives in the health sector, the National Health Authority initiative, Ayushman Bharat, to take care of the 50, 60 crore people who are at the bottom of the pyramid. All of these are activities of economic nature, which are kind of bringing order to the chaos that we have within India. And so I would say that's one economic frontier that we are, focusing on. And clearly, I think the focus has been on a healthy competition among states to be able to deliver a better quality of life for its people, to be able to stay within the competitive benchmark of states and other states doing the same for their people. So I think that's a very encouraging phenomenon that's coming into this landscape of the country. States, ranking of states, competitive environment, people pushing their governments to say, why can't we be in the same quality of life as X or Y or Z? Why can't my city be as clean as Indore, for example? So these questions are coming, which are all very, very healthy and constructive expectations and ask, and which are going to push governments to the brink to be able to deliver outcomes. That's the first thing. The other thing is, I think Professor Chaturvedi talked about many diplomacies, but I think the real big opportunity of diplomacy for India is what I call digital diplomacy. We have the ability to transform lives through injection of technology, as we have done for ourselves within our own country. And I think our development partner administration section of the Ministry of External Affairs ought to take some of these experiences to the rest of the friendly developing world of India and go and sort out their problems. For example, we have done for ourselves a national identification system, which we can easily take to the rest of the world who are struggling to provide identity to their own citizens. We have a very mature personal direct taxation system that we have built for ourselves, which we can take and help other countries who are friends of India to improve their own revenue and sustainability of the government exchequer. We have done land records digitization. We have done municipal automation. All of these, we have done passport. I personally drove the passport program in India when I was in TCS. These are things that we can take as digital diplomacy efforts to be able to take that been there, done that experience and deliver it so that similar transformation can be achieved for friends of India who really need. For example, we had the Prime Minister of Uganda come to one of the passport seva kendras in Delhi and said, I only dream that our passport system is anywhere near what you have developed. So clearly there is an opportunity and a space, rather than competing with China to build dams or roads in these countries in Africa, which they can obviously do better and pump in more money. I think the soft power that we have in terms of digital capabilities is an opportunity for us to really explore as a country with all the friends that we have, and indeed win newer friends around the world, in the developing world. I think that clearly is an opportunity that we have. In terms of, the other capabilities from the corporate sector, whilst, you look at this whole business of mitigation of the China strategy that the US is embarking upon after having got inflicted with severe pain as a result of the pandemic, this is another opportunity that we have to be able to bring in capability into the country in the area of manufacturing. And I think you can see rapid strides being taken in the semiconductor space, in several other areas which India was deficient in. I think we have demonstrated the example of the fact that pre-pandemic, we had no ability to even manufacture PPE kits in the country. And we have a situation today where we are actually exporting PPE kits after having fulfilled our domestic requirements. So push comes to the shove and our backs to the wall. I think there is enough resilience within the country to be able to stand up to the challenge and deliver constructive, measurable outcomes. If you look at ourselves in any of the other import substitution areas, Professor Chaturvedi talked about the report and the analysis that he's done, that we are in the process of exploring alternative sources of items to be imported from other countries to be able to mitigate this whole dependence on China. The balance of trade between India and China is horrific in terms of we being so grossly deficient in our ability to send things back to China versus the amount of stuff that we bring in from China. So clearly balances are being found, but these are not overnight espresso coffee kind of across the counter solutions that can happen instantly. These have a process and a timeline. And I think all of us are consciously kind of working towards that. The other is to be able to get big corporations of the stature and size that we see in the rest of the world coming into India. And you can see signs of the fact that in the last 18 to 24 months, there are about 20 unicorns that have been announced within the startup community in India. So that should show to you the capability, the so far subdued capability that India has, which is now getting unleashed with a lot of stimulation and incentives from the government, from the different ministries, especially the Ministry of Information Technology and Telecom. They are encouraging and they are engaging with the private sector to be able to catalyze and unleash some of these capabilities and innovative, creative minds of Indian entrepreneurs that you can see in evidence in adequate measure. So I think we are at this part of the curve right now. We are at the takeoff stage. Our market is extremely potent by ourselves. In fact, if we can get India to consume what we produce itself is a self-sustainable proposition. But for that, we will have to improve our distribution. We have 65-70% aspirational consumption emerging and growing in the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 towns of the country. And that is a so far unfulfilled demand, which is really the potential, which is the upside. So far, everybody's been focusing on tier 1 cities. And we have so much left in terms of potential. So clearly there are enough attributes for us to be able to move forward. I think the very confident and bold step taking central government and consistency for the last 5-7 years is another catalytic input to this, in spite of all the noise that we see around us. I mean, we have enough and more showstoppers around us in the neighborhood as well as within the country who are continuing to hold back India, the potential of India, and who are continuing to stop this whole journey of the country being unleashed of its own potential, realizing our own potential. I think that is what is the discovery. And most importantly, I think the demographic dividend potency of India. We will feed skilled labor, manpower to all of Europe. They have to realize one day that they have to open up their visa regimes because they are aging as a continent. Japan is aging as a continent. India's average age and demographic capability will be the positive contributor to the workforce, the skilled, unskilled workforce, labor force around the world in the future. and the repatriation income potential from these workers who will go around the world, because there will be sheer need because of the aging population around the world. So therefore, we are also equally focusing on skilling and creating capacity to be able to not only serve our own markets, but also the global job markets. So I think that's another track and potential area for us. So I think I'll not go on and on. I think there is cautious optimism that I had carry that our next generation is going to see India not as a military superpower. We want to first fix our own economy. We have enough problems of our own to sort out for the next generation, to make it a value proposition for them to remain in India and be a proud Indian. We have enough and more work to do. We would like to share the capabilities, the experience that we have as a country with other friendly countries who believe that we've been able to deliver to our own people. And that we can do by bringing them here or showcasing our experiences to them, and to be able to establish a conviction that, yes, India has been there and done that, and therefore they can do it for us with all the learnings that they have. And that's very truly evident in the whole discussion that I had with you, and I've written a paper on this called Digital Diplomacy. That, I believe, is the true potential that can be unleashed from India, which hitherto is not a priority, not much of a priority for India, which I think it ought to be, because that's the real strength that we have as a country. We have been slowly but steadily solving our problems using technology. And a silent revolution is taking place, accelerated by the pandemic, by way of the fact that today internet access for an average Indian is as much equally important as the oxygen that he breathes. Even in the rural areas, people are connecting with the people in the urban areas using the BharatNet infrastructure that is getting put in place through the fiber optics, and internet connectivity, connecting an elderly mother on a video WhatsApp call with the son in the city. So enabling factors, the ability of the fact that we have more mobile phones than any other part of the world other than China, is, I think, today a highly underused tool that we have, through which we have to push a lot more mobile transactional application capability to be able to get. Look at the way we are proliferating the e-pay market. Currency is being displaced. Even a vegetable vendor today has a phone pay barcode on top of the vegetables, and you can actually buy vegetables today not using cash. So clearly, I think we have traditionally grossly underestimated the average Indian's ability to absorb technology. Look at the way proliferation of ATMs has completely changed the banking system, and today we are on internet banking in the urban areas, and ATM is dispensing cash in the tier 2, tier 3 cities. Nobody has taught anybody how to use an ATM, but a mahol has been created, and people have immediately adopted to that digital environment. So I think that's the true potential. I'll end here, but I think there is enough and more work globally as opportunities for India. And of course, we have a tremendous agenda within the country to bring what I call order to the chaos. With 1.4 billion people, I think the single largest agenda of any leadership in this country is to bring order to the chaos. We have chaos in every sphere of life, and we need to bring order. And if we are able to bring order, we will be cascading ourselves as a country manifold than where we are today.
Thank you, Tanmoyji. I think that was a very candid, very insightful reflection. Obviously, you started out why it is so important to have a human being at the core of all endeavors. I think that was a very that basic fact many of us easily forget, that why it should be so, that why it is so important. The other point also about you beautifully pointed out what are the priority areas. I mean, ultimately with the changing economic scenario, so low cost urban housing, so you have drinking water problems, urban transportation. I think these are the key areas where the government is also, in fact, focusing. So thanks for pointing out that. And I think I think there is a change that ultimately it is. We are now living in an aspirational India, which you rightly pointed out, is now demanding more and more from government in terms of services. I think that's a very important point, and that's exactly why you see. And again, I think the credit also here goes to the Modi government for the so-called improving its rankings on ease of doing business, but also competition among states themselves. I think that has really pushed the bar above for in terms of government services. And I think a very important area for India's economic diplomacy is really digital services, digital diplomacy. And I think that is where it is important that I mean, you rightly pointed out that why not Europe? I mean, why not even Africa? That what Indian experiences can really be taken on a very low cost, profitable basis for these countries. So India needs to be focusing more on this skill power immigration. I mean that remains a very important point. So I think that's yeah. So obviously you went it on a very, I mean, a very philosophical note that ultimately it is really about bringing order to chaos around us, and I think that is where the fundamental challenge for any government lies. But before I hand over, so thank you again for those brilliant remarks. So before I hand over to Dr. Meena Singh Roy, I just have a small question. Obviously, working all these years in the corporate world with the Tatas, can you tell us what is that one single attribute, trait, which really gives you global success? What do you think? What is the value you are bringing to the table that is appreciated in the corporate world internationally? So I would like to know that.
I think the fundamental pillar of any corporate who have lived 154 years, we are celebrating our 155th year of existence as a group, is that we have been able to win the trust of our customers. And that's by being truthful to all the work that we do. We do things pretty silently. We don't make too much noise. In all that we do, we try to excel. And most importantly, it is the care of the individual. For us, the employee is our only asset as a group. And I have personally spent 32 years of my life in the group. And I have been privileged to have been associated with many significant initiatives which have transformed the way in which our governments work. And I've been privileged to have been working with government as a partner, if I can say. And clearly it is to develop the trust. And I think what India is doing today with the rest of the developing world and the friends of India is to be building the trust of theirs, that the India's efforts are sincere and genuine. Look at ourselves in terms of our own innovative capability. You have to have developed 2 vaccines, to have been able to readily distribute this to many needy countries, to go and stand with any country whenever there is a calamity in those countries. So I think all of these measures are to demonstrate the sincere and genuine effort of India to develop trust. We have always been invaded, we have never invaded. So this is an historical reality. So I think coming back to from the corporate sector, any corporate entity, whether it's a company or a group, can thrive, can grow if they win the trust of their customers. So I think that's the single line answer for your question.
I think that's I mean, that is, I think, at a basic human interface, I think ultimately trust matters. And I think that's a brilliant observation. And I'm sure many of us would really look, I mean, but this is so important for in our interactions. So with this, yeah, Dr. Meena Singh Roy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Manish. I think these 2 presentations were excellent, and I personally have been educated in a lot of areas. I have a comment and a question to Mr. Tanmoy. Your presentation was excellent, and I agree with everything that you said. And let me also accept, here that I am a big fan of the Tatas. Not for any other reason, but I do feel that Tatas, they are the only industry who have been a partner in building the nation. And I think that is what matters for people like me. I mean, I don't have any private sector experience. I have 2, 3, I think the priorities that you highlighted are completely important, areas, health, infrastructure, hygiene, clean drinking water. And I think when we look at future, it is the food and the water security which is going to drive, of course, the nations, whether they cooperate, the climate issues, or, they really compete and yet they contain each other. But one point, when you talk about the nation, our focus has to be at a national level. And when you talk about the diplomacy, it will work at all the 3 levels, at national level, at regional and international levels. But coming to this point of the hygiene, I mean, how do we work? I mean, as a private sector, I know the major goal is also, profit. Now, knowing it, there's something which I feel, what private sector can do that government may not be able to do. This public-private partnership is, of course, a very good proposition. Waste management, I think, is one very, very important, issue which we need to struggle with when we're talking about technology, the waste that we would be having. And I think we need to probably, think how we are going to manage it. And how do you think the private sector can really come in helping, manage this waste? And what should be India's strategy to deal with this problem, which is going to be a major, major one as far as I can see it. And on the issue of hygiene, is it possible? This struck me that to what extent, each big company can either adopt a city or a state, to create, greater awareness among the people when it comes to hygiene. I think, educating people, there is a lot of difference in, cleaning it and maintaining hygiene. And there comes, how do we educate people? I don't think people understand that difference between the hygiene and the cleanliness. You can broom a place, but when it comes to hygiene, people are not aware about it. So that, awareness that one can drive. Of course, there are a lot of NGOs, and Tata has been doing a very good job, be it social work, be it looking after many issues, education, technology, name a industry, you're all there. But other private companies, do you think, there is any possibility of, each sort of industry or major ones I'm talking, Mahendra's or, Tata's and Ambani's and others, is there a possibility in a major way that they can adopt a city, I mean, is that workable? So I will sort of, and I think this question of demography is extremely important point, whether we look at Germany, whether we look at France, whether we look at any European country or Russia, for example. It is going to be Indians and the Chinese. And even in the UK today, we see, Chinese and the Indians are all over the place. So while we have our own image, there is greater trust and, as far as Indians are concerned, but we will also be competing with the smart, skilled Chinese people in the world. So I'll stop here.
No, that's a very interesting question. In fact, if you look at Tata Steel makes profits, gives dividends to shareholders, and also manages to keep Jamshedpur clean for the last 100 years. So I think that's an example in front of us, which is where cities can be kept clean, provided the mahol, the environment, as I call it, the environment drives the behavior of the people. So when somebody from Indore today sees that the Indore city is getting the cleanliness award for 3 years in a row, the citizen has become conscious not to make the city dirty because they are proud that they are living in the cleanest city in the country. So I think the onus on us and the real solution for this problem of the filth and the garbage that we see mounting all over the place is to have sustainable municipal corporations. All our municipalities are defunct financially. So therefore, waste management becomes the last item on the list. First is, of course, giving salaries to their employees, absolutely over-bloated payroll staff. Lot of colossal waste of expenditure. Of course, the mounting corruption that we have in the quality of, fixing the roads and other infrastructure programs where a lot of money goes. So waste management becomes low down in the list. So the solution to the problem is to be able to create a mahal of cleanliness so that the citizens can then adopt to living in a clean environment. Look at the way our banking behavior has changed just by the banks setting up an ATM network, and further changed when the banks came out with internet banking. We don't even step out of our laptops or mobile phones now to bank. But the mahal has been created so that people can adopt to that change. So we need viable, sustainable municipal bodies to be able to tackle efficiently the waste management. Private partnerships are absolutely possible in this area, provided the municipalities open up and create an open door for partnerships. Technologies are available in the country for low-cost waste collection and disposal, as well as recycling. So all of this should become high priority because we are turning our cities into garbage dumps. And with more and more urbanization, the problem is going to get more and more acute if you don't tackle it. So I absolutely am with you when you say that we definitely need to prioritize on this as one of the important elements of work or activity or prioritization that we need to do. But I think it has to begin by sustainable municipal corporations who have this on a mission mode basis as a priority. So financial stability has to come to municipal corporations. Municipalities have to get into the business of issuing municipal bonds to be able to inject money into them. They have to transform and corporatize their structure. They can't remain a quasi-political. It has to work like a company. It has to be working like a corporate. Look at all the famous mayors of major cities around the world. They run those cities like a corporate entity. Here we have politics which overtakes municipal activities, and therefore we end up ourselves in such chaotic cities which are getting even more chaotic by the day. So there has to be a fundamental structural transformation in municipal local governance in the country. And then I'm sure you will see the change. If Indore can do it, why can't 100 other cities in India do it? That's the question that we need to ask.
Thanks, Tanmoyji. What a fascinating session this has been. I'm sure everyone would agree with that. We had really some very brilliant observations from Professor Sachin Chaturvedi earlier, and Tanmoyji since last, more than 15-20 minutes. So this is fantastic, and there have been many key takeaways from this session that. Despite the pandemic, despite whatever chaos we see around, India is a land of opportunities. The Indian way is going to really is a world-beating sort of enterprise in many ways. And I think if we stick to our own core values, which are actually our civilizational values of trust, empathy, compassion, and even excellence. And I think if we stick to those values, we are definitely we are going to catch up with China and maybe go ahead beyond China in very soon. So on this very optimistic note, I really thank all the participants, but especially Professor Chaturvedi and Shri Tanmay Chakravarti ji, for really enlightening us with their brilliant remarks. And we hope to carry these conversations ahead, maybe in hybrid form. Let's see. I mean, I hope God is more kinder to us, or maybe the Chinese are more kinder to us. We can say that now. And looking forward to restarting this conference tomorrow evening at 5:30. So please do join us. I also want to acknowledge the presence of, in fact, Vice Admiral Ghormade Saab, who is the Vice Chief of Indian Navy. He is with us since evening, since the first session itself. I just forgot to mention that. So age is catching up, I guess, with me too. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And it's been a brilliant conference till now, and I'm sure it is going to be much more exciting tomorrow. So looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you very much. Good night. Take care.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you for having me here, Manish. Bye-bye.